Clara Bennett pressed her mother's recipe journal against her chest like a shield as the boarding house door slammed in her face, loud enough for every soul on that street to hear. 29 years old, $3 in her pocket, and the whole town of Red Hollow watching her stand in the summer dust with nowhere left to go. That was the moment everything changed. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow Clara's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach pulled out of Red Hollow before the dust had even settled, and Clara Bennett was still standing in the middle of the main street when it disappeared around the bend. She didn't move right away. She gave herself exactly 3 seconds. 3 long private seconds to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and breathed through her nose the way her mother had taught her when the world decided to be cruel. The journal was still pressed against her ribs. She could feel the soft, worn leather of it through the fabric of her dress. Her mother's handwriting was inside recipes remedies, little notes in the margins about which herbs settled a grieving stomach and which ones brought color back to a pale face. Clara had carried that journal from Missouri all the way to Colorado, and she was not going to let a locked door in a town called Red Hollow be the end of the story. But Lord, it stung. The woman who'd refused her was named Mrs. Aldrich. She ran the only boarding house in Red Hollow, and she had written Clara a letter 6 weeks ago, a careful, specific letter that described room and board, kitchen duties, laundry twice weekly, and honest wages paid on the 1st of each month. Clara had read that letter so many times, the fold lines had gone soft. She'd planned her whole departure around it. Sold what she couldn't carry. Said goodbye to the 2 people left in Hannibal who would notice she was gone. Spent 4 days on a train and 2 more on a stagecoach sitting beside strangers who smelled like tobacco and didn't speak to her, watching Missouri flatten into Kansas, and then Kansas rise up into Colorado foothills. She had arrived at Red Hollow at 10:30 in the morning, travel-worn and dusty and tired, in the deep, specific way that comes from hoping very hard for a long time. Mrs. Aldrich had looked her over on the boarding house porch. Looked her over the way a person examines a piece of cloth they're considering returning to the merchant. Her eyes moved from Clara's face to her dress, to her carpet bag, to her face again, and then she said without a single tremor of regret, "I expected someone more presentable. My guests have standards, Miss Bennett. I'm afraid you won't do." Clara had said very quietly, "You wrote me a letter, ma'am." "I wrote several letters," Mrs. Aldrich replied. "Circumstances change." The porch had a small cluster of women standing along its railing, and every one of them heard. A man across the street loading feed sacks onto a wagon heard. The 2 children sitting on the general store steps heard. Red Hollow was not a large town. Sound traveled. "You brought me all the way from Missouri," Clara said. Mrs. Aldrich didn't flinch. "I didn't bring you anywhere. You chose to come. That's hardly my concern." Then she turned around and went inside, and the door closed, and that was the sound Clara had been standing with ever since. She was considering her options and finding them extremely limited when she heard the horse. It wasn't the sound of a horse moving through town on ordinary business. This was something bigger, something purposeful, and the sound of it made the men near the feed store straighten up and the women on Mrs. Aldrich's porch stop murmuring to each other. Clara turned. The rider came in from the northern road at an easy pace that still somehow communicated urgency. The kind of ease that belongs to men who have spent so many years in the saddle that haste and calm look identical on them. He was large. Not in an overfed way, but in the way of a man whose body has been shaped entirely by labor and altitude and years of work that most people never see. He wore a dark hat with the brim low, and his jaw was set, and he was looking straight at the general store with the focused expression of a man who had come to accomplish something specific and had no interest in anything else. He didn't look at Clara. He swung down from the horse in front of the general store with the fluid economy of a man who had done it 10,000 times, looped the reins over the post without looking, and walked inside. Clara looked down at her carpet bag. She looked up at the sky. She thought very hard about dignity and what it cost, and whether she had enough of it left to walk to the next town on foot. She decided she did not have enough left for that. Not today. She was still standing there 12 minutes later when the rider came back out. He had a paper-wrapped parcel under one arm and a box of nails in his opposite hand, and he was moving toward his horse when he slowed, stopped, turned his head toward her in the way a man does when something in his peripheral vision doesn't match the expected pattern. He looked at her directly for the first time. Clara looked back at him. She was too tired for anything else. His eyes were a dark weathered brown, and they moved quickly, not the roaming look of a man being rude, but the sharp survey of someone accustomed to reading situations fast. He took in the carpetbag on the ground beside her, the journal pressed against her chest. The particular quality of stillness that belongs to a person who is holding themselves together by an extremely thin thread. He looked at Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house, then back at Clara. "That where you were headed," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, a Colorado mountain voice shaped by distance and silence. "It was," Clara said. "She turned you away." Clara considered lying, decided against it on the grounds that it required more energy than she currently possessed. She did. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of a man thinking of something to say, more the silence of a man deciding something. "You got anywhere else to be?" he asked. "Not at present," Clara said with as much dignity as the situation allowed. He set the box of nails on the edge of the porch railing and looked at her again with that same quick, measuring attention. "You cook," he said. The question caught her off guard. "I beg your pardon?" "Cook," he said again, as though maybe she'd misheard. "You know how to cook a proper meal." "I grew up in a household of 7, Clara said slowly. "I've been cooking since I was 8 years old." "What else?" She blinked. "I'm sorry. What else can you do?" He wasn't being rude about it. He was asking the way a man asks about a tool, practical, direct, no malice in it. Clara pulled herself up to her full height, which was not very impressive in absolute terms, but felt significant in that moment. "I can manage a kitchen, keep household accounts, preserve dry and identify medicinal herbs, tend the sick, do laundry, bake, and sew well enough to make a shirt that fits correctly. I speak plainly, I don't complain without cause, and I show up to work when I say I will." He watched her through all of this without expression. "Ranch is 5 miles up into the foothills," he said. "It's a hard 5 miles. Kitchen hasn't been used properly in near 2 years. My uncle's sick and he won't eat, and if he doesn't start eating soon, I'm going to lose him. I need someone who can cook, keep the house, and not be scared off by hard circumstances." He paused. "Wages are fair, and you'd have your own room. It's honest work." Clara stared at him. "You're offering me a job," she said. "I am." "You don't know me." "You don't know me either," he said. "Way I see it, that makes us even." She looked at him for a long moment, looked at the closed door of the boarding house behind her, looked down at her carpetbag. "I don't even know your name," she said. He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. "Caleb Whitaker." "Clara Bennett," she said. He nodded once. "You want the work or not, Miss Bennett?" Clara picked up her carpetbag. "I want the work," she said. She heard the whispers start before they'd even reached his horse. The women on Mrs. Aldrich's porch had made no effort to be quiet about it. Clara caught words in passing, desperate and foolish, and no better than she should be, and she kept her chin level and her pace steady, and did not look toward the porch. Caleb Whitaker gave no indication that he heard any of it. He loaded his parcel into the saddlebag and then stood at the horse's side with a patience that seemed to come from somewhere very deep and very settled in him. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Not well," Clara admitted. He nodded as though this was not a problem. He helped her up without ceremony, a straightforward professional assistance. Nothing in it that was anything other than practical. And then he mounted behind her, and they moved out of Red Hollow at the same easy pace he'd arrived with. Clara sat straight and didn't look back. She thought about looking back once when they reached the edge of town. She decided against it. There was nothing there worth turning around for. The road into the foothills was exactly as advertised. Hard, steep in places carved through summer-dry scrub and switchback grades that made Clara grip the saddle horn with both hands and concentrate on the horizon. The air changed as they climbed thinner, sharper, carrying the smell of pine resin and something clean underneath it that Clara didn't have a name for, but that her lungs recognized immediately as better than what she'd been breathing in the lowland dust. Caleb Whitaker didn't speak much. He said, "Watch your head," when a low branch crossed the trail, and "Road's better past this next rise," when it got particularly rough and nothing else. Clara didn't try to fill the silence. She had learned a long time ago that not all silences needed filling. "Your uncle," she said after a while. "What kind of sick?" A pause. "Grief sick mostly," Caleb said. "He lost his wife 3 winters ago, and he hasn't been the same since. Stopped eating regular, stopped talking much. Ranch hand told me last week he'd gone 2 days without eating anything at all." "How old is he?" 64. "Is he being seen by a doctor?" "Doc Purvis came out in March," Caleb said. "Said there wasn't much physically wrong that food and purpose wouldn't fix. Said grief was the disease and there wasn't a medicine for it." Clara thought about that. "There's no medicine," she said, "but there are things that help. Warmth, familiar smells, something worth waking up for." She paused. "What did his wife cook?" Another beat of quiet. When Caleb spoke again, his voice was slightly different, not softer exactly, but careful in a new way. "Rosemary bread," he said. "She kept a kitchen herb garden. Caleb always said you could smell her kitchen from the lower pasture when the wind came right." Clara filed that away. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Not badly, there was nothing foul in it. It was the smell of a place that had gone quiet. Dust and dry wood, and the particular flat stillness of a house where no one had opened the windows in a long time. There was a kitchen garden that had gone mostly to seed, and Clara could see from the saddle that there were herbs in it, rosemary among them, still stubbornly alive in the summer heat, leggy and unpruned but breathing. The house was solid. Stone foundation, good timber built by someone who meant it to last. But it wore its neglect the way a person wears exhaustion, in the lines of it, in the small broken things no one had gotten around to fixing, in the curtainless windows that gave the whole face of it a stripped, vulnerable look. Caleb helped her down from the horse with the same practical efficiency as before. "Kitchen's through the main door on the left," he said. "I'll show you the room after." Clara picked up her carpet bag and walked toward the house. The kitchen was cold. Not cold in temperature, it was July, and the Colorado summer did not permit cold even in the foothills. Cold in the way a room goes cold when the life has been taken out of it. The stove was clean but unused looking, the kind of clean that comes from absence rather than care. The table had a fine layer of dust across its surface. There were pots hanging on their hooks, good pots, heavy and well made, but they had the look of things that hadn't been touched in a very long time. Clara set her carpet bag down beside the door. She ran one finger along the edge of the stove and looked at what came away on it. Then she looked around the room slowly at the cold firebox, at the empty bread tin at the window that faced the herb garden, and had been shut so long it had swollen slightly in its frame. She had seen kitchens like this before. Not often. Only in houses where something had broken that the people inside didn't know how to fix. She went to the window first. It took both hands and some effort, but it came open eventually, and the summer air came in warm and pine-scented and alive, and something in the room shifted immediately the way a room shifts when it remembers what it's for. "What are you doing?" The voice came from the doorway that led deeper into the house. It was a man's voice, old and rough-edged, and it carried in it the particular sharpness of someone who has spent a long time in a silence they've started to prefer. Clara turned around. Amos Whitaker was in the doorway with one hand on the frame, wearing a shirt that had been ironed at some point in the past but wasn't anymore, and looking at her with an expression that was equal parts suspicion and offense. He was lean in the way of a man who hadn't been eating enough, and his eyes were a sharp pale color under brows gone white, and he was looking at her open window with undisguised displeasure. "I opened the window," Clara said. "I can see that," Amos said. "I'm asking why." "Because the room needed air," Clara said. "And because I'm about to build a fire in that stove and get something on it, and a kitchen with a fire in it and no air circulation gets unpleasant very quickly." A pause. "Who are you?" "Clara Bennett. Your nephew hired me this morning." Amos made a sound that was not quite disagreement and not quite acceptance. His eyes moved to her carpetbag, then to her mother's journal, which she'd set on the table when she came in. "What's that?" he said. "My mother's recipe book," Clara said. Something shifted in his expression, small, almost invisible. But Clara had been reading old men's faces since she was a child, and she caught it. "My mother kept rosemary in her garden," she said as though they were simply having a conversation. "I noticed you have some still growing out there. It's gone leggy, but the roots are good. I'll cut it back and it'll come again." She paused. "Rosemary bread takes about 2 hours from start to finish. If you'll excuse me, I'll get started." Amos looked at her for a very long moment. "The wood's in the box beside the porch," he said finally, and turned and went back into the house. Clara considered this a satisfactory opening. She had the fire built and the kitchen warm before Caleb came back from settling the horse. She heard him stop in the doorway. She didn't turn around. "He's not going to make this easy," Caleb said. "He doesn't have to," Clara said. She was measuring out flour with the calm efficiency of someone who had learned to cook in conditions that didn't allow for hesitation. "He just has to stay in the house long enough to smell the bread." Caleb was quiet for the moment. "You've dealt with grief-sick people before." It wasn't a question. "My father," she said, "after my mother died." She didn't elaborate. The subject had natural borders, and she trusted Caleb Whitaker to recognize them. He did. "I'll be out in the east pasture most of the afternoon," he said. "If you need anything, there's a ranch hand named Dell who'll be around the barn." "All right," Clara said. He didn't move for a second. She could feel him still standing in the doorway, though she couldn't have said exactly how she knew it. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Whitaker." "Thank you," he said, "for taking the work." "Thank you for offering it," Clara said. Then she heard his boots on the floorboards, and then the door. And then she was alone in the kitchen with the fire she'd built, and the flour on the table, and the summer air coming through the open window, and somewhere outside in the gone-to-seed herb garden, the rosemary her fingers were already planning to find. She had the bread in the oven and the first batch of herb stock simmering by the time she found the old record box. It wasn't hidden exactly. It was on the top shelf of the kitchen's narrow pantry, pushed to the back behind 2 empty pickle jars and a tin of salt that had gone solid from moisture. Clara had been taking stock of what the pantry held when she found it, and it was the kind of thing you found when you were really looking, not when you were glancing. It was a flat wooden box, the kind used for keeping documents flat and dry, and it had the initials A.W. scratched into the lid in the rough hand of a man who had done it himself rather than having it done for him. She didn't open it. She set it carefully on the table, noted where it was, and went back to what she was doing. But she thought about it. Amos came into the kitchen an hour later, moving slowly, and doing it with the careful casualness of a man trying to pretend he has a reason other than the one he actually has. "Just getting water," he said, though the water pitcher was on the table where Clara had put it, plainly visible. "Of course," Clara said. She was pulling the bread from the oven. The smell of it had been filling the kitchen for the past 20 minutes, rosemary and warm crust, and the yeasty living smell of properly made bread. And she had watched with her peripheral vision the way the door to the inner hallway had opened about 4 inches, approximately 18 minutes ago, and then very quietly not closed all the way. Amos poured himself a cup of water. He stood with his back to her, doing it slowly, and then he stood with the cup in his hand, doing nothing in particular. "That's rosemary bread," he said, not a question. It is, Clara said. My mother's recipe. She always added a little honey to the top crust, which isn't traditional, but I think it's better. Amos turned around. He looked at the bread on the table, golden brown, just out of the oven, the kind of bread that a man could smell from the lower pasture if the wind came right. Margaret made rosemary bread, he said. His voice had gone flat and careful, the way voices go when a person is trying to manage something they weren't expecting to have to manage. Your wife? Clara said. My wife. A pause. She's been gone 3 years. I'm sorry, Clara said. Simply and without elaboration, the way her mother had taught her, say it, and mean it, and don't dress it up. Amos looked at the bread for a long moment. I'm not hungry, he said. That's all right, Clara said. I'll leave a plate on the table in case you change your mind. He went back to the hallway door. It won't taste the same, he said with his back to her. It'll taste like mine, Clara said. That's different, but mine's not bad. He didn't answer, but he didn't close the door all the way when he went back through it. Dell. The ranch hand came by the kitchen door at midday for the noon meal, which Clara had ready, a thick bean and salt pork soup with the heel of the morning's bread and some early apples from the tree she'd found near the east fence. Dell was a compact, weather-dark man in his 40s, with a gap between his front teeth and the look of someone who had been running on minimal provisions for quite a while. He ate with focused appreciation and said almost nothing during the meal except, "Much obliged," twice, and near the end, "Ain't had a proper meal in this kitchen since before Margaret passed." How long ago was that exactly? Clara asked. Be 3 years come October, Dell said. Cal does his best, but... He stopped himself, glanced toward the interior of the house. He ain't much for kitchens. Most men aren't, Clara said. Ranch is in decent enough shape, Dell continued, considering. Cal works harder than any 2 men I've known. But there's things going wrong that hard work alone can't fix. He seemed to consider whether to say more, and apparently decided she'd earned it. That land agent Crow has been sniffing around the north boundary, the one with the spring. Clara looked up from the pot she was washing. What kind of sniffing? The kind that usually ends with papers, Dell said. He touched the brim of his hat. That was a fine meal, Miss Bennett. Best I've had on this ranch in years. He paused at the door. You hold on to that box you found in the pantry. Clara went still. Dell's expression was neutral. Amos kept his deed records in there, he said. All of them. Margaret made him write down everything, every boundary mark, every survey note, every change to the property line going back to when they first settled here. He held her gaze for a moment. A man like Crow counts on people not knowing what they have. Then he put his hat back on and went back out to the pasture, and Clara dried her hands on the dishcloth and stood looking at the wooden box on the table with the initials A.W. scratched into the lid. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the early evening going through the deed records with her mother's journal open beside her when she heard Caleb's boots on the porch. He came through the door and stopped when he saw what she was doing. Where'd you get those? He said. Found them in the pantry, Clara said. Dell told me what they were. She looked up. Sit down, Mr. Whitaker. I want to show you something. He crossed to the table and sat across from her, still in his work coat, and looked at what she'd spread out. His expression went through something she couldn't quite read. Not surprise, exactly, more like a man seeing something he'd been trying not to think about, brought out into the open light. These are the original boundary markers, Clara said. The survey notes from when this land was first settled. Look at this line here. She pointed. That marks the north boundary of the spring access. Caleb leaned forward. His jaw tightened. Crow's claim, Clara said, puts his boundary line here. She indicated a different point. But look at this notation. This is Amos's handwriting, and it cross-references the original federal survey from 1871. The spring falls inside your boundary by a quarter mile. She paused. If someone drew a new boundary line and claimed the spring, they would have had to falsify these markers. Caleb was very still. You read survey documents, he said. My father surveyed farmland in Missouri for 12 years, Clara said. I used to help him copy the records. She met his eyes. Someone is planning to steal your water, Mr. Whitaker. Caleb sat back. The lamplight caught the angles of his face, a hard, weathered face that had learned to keep things inside, and that was failing at it slightly right now in the quiet kitchen of the house where his uncle refused to eat and the windows had been closed for 2 years. Crow's been making offers on the north pasture for 8 months, he said. I kept saying no. Last week he said his patience was running out. His voice was even, but something in it wasn't. I didn't know about the survey records. Amos never talked about them. He wrote everything down, though, Clara said. His wife made him. Something crossed Caleb's face when she said it, quick and unguarded and gone again. Margaret was thorough, he said. She may have just saved this ranch, Clara said. They sat with that for a moment, the lamplight, the smell of rosemary bread still hanging in the warm kitchen air, the open documents between them. You found all this today, Caleb said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. I was organizing the pantry, Clara said simply. He looked at her for a long time. Miss Bennett, he said finally. Mr. Whitaker. You are not what I expected, he said. It was the most words he'd put together at one time since that morning on the Red Hollow Main Street. Clara held his gaze and kept her voice level. To be honest, she said, neither are you. She heard Amos's door open at 7 o'clock. She was at the stove keeping the evening stew warm, a proper beef stew with the herbs she'd cut from the garden, rosemary and thyme, and a little sage. And she heard his slow, deliberate steps in the hallway, and then he was in the kitchen doorway again. He looked at the stew pot. He looked at the table where she'd set a bowl and a spoon and a piece of bread without comment and without invitation. I'm not hungry, he said. Same as before. I know, Clara said. It'll keep. He stood in the doorway for a full minute. Clara stirred the pot and didn't look at him and let him make up his own mind. He sat down at the table. He picked up the spoon. He ate the entire bowl without speaking, and then he sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at nothing for a while, and Clara let him do that too. It's not the same, he said finally. No, Clara agreed. It's not. It's good, though, he said, and his voice had lost some of its carefully maintained sharpness. Thank you, Clara said. Amos unfolded his hands, looked at them. Margaret would have liked you, he said. She had no patience for people who felt sorry for themselves. A pause. Including me. Clara turned from the stove and looked at him directly. She sounds like a woman worth knowing, she said. Amos looked up. His pale eyes were very steady, and behind their steadiness there was something that had been locked up for a long time and was not yet ready to come all the way out. She was, he said. She was the kind of woman who kept records of everything that mattered, and never let anyone tell her those things didn't count. Clara held his gaze and thought about the wooden box with AW scratched into the lid. The things that matter always count, she said, even when people try to tell you otherwise. Amos was quiet for a long time. Then he said, The survey markers. You found them. I did, Clara said. Crow's been lying about that boundary for the better part of a year, Amos said. His voice had changed again, not soft anymore, not careful, something harder and clearer underneath it, like a man who has been half asleep remembering what it felt like to be awake. I know, Clara said. Cal doesn't know about those records. He does now, Clara said. I showed him this evening. Amos looked at her. Miss Bennett, he said slowly. Mr. Whitaker. He put both hands flat on the table and pushed himself to standing with the deliberate effort of a man who has let himself get weaker than he should have. I've been sitting in that room for 3 years waiting to die, he said. Margaret would have had some things to say about that. I expect she would have, Clara said. He moved toward the hallway door, stopped with one hand on the frame. What time do you serve breakfast? He said. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, that she hadn't realized had been tight. "Sunrise," she said. "Or thereabouts." Amos nodded, once the way his nephew nodded, short decided the nod of a man who has made up his mind. "I'll be there," he said. He went back through the doorway, and this time he left the door open. Clara washed the evening dishes by lamplight with the kitchen window open, and the summer night air moving through the room, carrying the smell of pine and dry grass, and the faint green sharpness of the herb garden she was already planning to restore. She thought about Mrs. Aldrich's door slamming in her face that morning, about the women on the porch and the words they'd let carry. She thought about Silas Crow, whose name she had now heard 3 times in one day, from 3 separate mouths, always with the same careful, controlled tone of people describing something dangerous they were trying not to look at directly. She thought about the deed records on the table, and the false boundary line, and the clean mountain spring on the north pasture of this ranch, and the way Dell had looked at her when he told her to hold on to that box. She dried the last bowl. She looked around the kitchen, warm-aired out, smelling of what had been cooked in it, and she thought this room was not dead. It was waiting. She understood waiting. She had done a great deal of it in 29 years. But she was beginning to understand that there was a difference between waiting and giving up, and that sometimes the only thing standing between the two was a woman who knew how to build a fire and read a survey document and make rosemary bread from a recipe written in her mother's careful handwriting. She closed her mother's journal. She banked the stove for the night. She picked up her carpet bag from beside the door and carried it to the room Caleb had shown her, small, clean, facing east, with a window that caught the morning light. She sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet of a house that was for the first time in a long time still breathing. And outside, in the darkness of a Colorado summer night, 5 miles above the town that had decided she wasn't worth a room. The ranch held its shape against the mountain stone foundation. Good timber, a herb garden coming back from seed, and a spring on the north pasture that no one was going to steal. Not while Clara Bennett was in the kitchen. Clara was at the stove before sunrise. She hadn't slept much. Not because the room was uncomfortable, it wasn't, but because her mind had been running the whole night through, moving from the deed records to the survey markers to the name Silas Crow, turning the pieces over the way her fingers turned dough, looking for what didn't fit, looking for where the fault lines ran. She built the fire first, then water for coffee. Then she stood in the kitchen in the early gray quiet and opened her mother's journal to the breakfast section and decided on biscuits, thick-cut salt pork and fried potatoes with dried onion, because those were foods that stuck to a man's ribs and reminded his body it had work to do. She was halfway through the biscuit dough when she heard boots in the hallway, not Caleb's. She already knew the sound of Caleb's boots, heavy, deliberate, a man whose weight settled into every step. These were slower, more careful. The boots of a man testing whether his own legs would hold him. Amos came through the doorway at 5:42 in the morning, wearing a clean shirt that he had ironed himself sometime between last night and now, and he stood in the kitchen looking at the fire and the coffee and the biscuit dough on the board, as though he was not entirely certain he hadn't imagined all of it. "You're up," Clara said. "Said I would be," Amos replied. He sat at the table. Not the chair at the far end where a man sits when he wants to be left alone, but the one near the stove where the heat reached. Clara poured him coffee without asking and set it in front of him and went back to her biscuits. He drank the coffee in silence. She let him. "You find everything you needed in that pantry," he said after a while. "Most of it," Clara said. "I'll need to go to town for a few things. Lard mostly, and some dried beans if there are none left. Salt. A few other things." Amos turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Dell can take you in the supply wagon. He goes Thursdays." "Today's Wednesday," Clara said. "So it is." A pause. "There's a root cellar behind the house. East side wood door in the ground. Margaret put up preserves every autumn. I don't know what's left, but there may be things down there still useful." Clara looked up. "You haven't checked it." Amos's hand stilled on the cup. "I haven't been back there," he said. Simple, flat, no elaboration needed. "I'll look today," Clara said just as simply. He nodded once, and didn't say anything else, and she didn't push, and between them in the warm kitchen, a kind of understanding settled that didn't need words to hold its shape. Caleb came in 20 minutes later, and he stopped in the doorway, the same way he'd stopped the evening before, that particular stillness of a man registering something unexpected. His uncle was sitting at the table eating biscuits. Caleb's eyes moved from Amos to Clara, to the stove to the table. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but something in it went quiet in a different register than his ordinary quiet. A quieter quiet, if such a thing could be said. And he sat down across from his uncle without a word, and accepted the plate Clara set in front of him, and ate. "You sleep?" Caleb asked Amos after a bit. "Some," Amos said. "Kitchen smells right again," Caleb said. It was not directed at anyone in particular. He said it the way a man says a thing he's been thinking and has decided is safe to let out. Amos looked at Clara. Clara looked at the stove. "It does," Amos said. That was the whole of it. But Clara had learned long ago that some of the most important conversations in a household were the short ones, the ones that looked like nothing and meant everything. She found the root cellar mid-morning. The wood door in the ground was heavy and swollen from seasons of rain and freeze, and it took both hands and most of her weight to pull it open. But when it came up, the smell that rose from it was the smell of a woman's years of labor, the sharp, bright smell of preserved fruit, the earthier smell of root vegetables, the faint, sweet, medicinal smell of dried herbs tied in bundles and hung in the cool dark. Margaret Whittaker had been thorough. There were jars of everything: green beans, tomatoes, apple butter, pickled beets, preserved peaches, chokecherry jam. There were dried bundles of sage and rosemary and thyme, and several things Clara had to bend close and smell to identify. There was a crock of lard, sealed with cloth and twine, that was still good. There were potatoes in a bin, some gone soft, but many still firm. Clara sat back on her heels at the edge of the cellar and looked at all of it, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was grief. Not her own grief, borrowed grief, the kind that comes from walking into the evidence of someone else's care, and understanding suddenly, concretely, what had been lost. Margaret Whittaker had spent years filling this cellar. She had done it one jar at a time, one season at a time, the way women build the invisible infrastructure of a home, quietly, routinely, without ceremony. And then she was gone, and the door had stayed closed, and the jars had sat in the dark. Clara picked up a jar of preserved peaches. She carried it back to the kitchen. She would use it for something worth using it for. She was cleaning the jars at the kitchen table when Dell appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, with an expression that had moved past its usual careful neutrality into something that had an edge on it. "Crow was in town this morning," Dell said. Clara set down the jar she was holding. "Doing what?" "Talking," Dell said. "At the feed store, at the post office, at the saloon. Talking about Cal, about the ranch." He paused. "About you." Clara looked at him directly. "What about me?" Dell turned his hat in his hands once. "Saying you came out here of your own accord, that you showed up at Cal's door without being asked, that a woman who can't get hired at a boarding house has no business running a man's household." He met her eyes. Said it loud enough to make sure the women in the post office heard it clear. The words landed the way Crow had meant them to pointed end first. Clara felt them. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But she had felt worse. Things said louder by people standing closer, and she had learned that the best response to that particular kind of attack was to keep her hands busy and her face quiet, and let the truth do what truth eventually did given time. "He's trying to make me leave," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Dell said. "And he's trying to make Cal look like a fool for hiring you." "Does Cal know?" "Not yet. He's up at the north pasture checking fence line." A pause. "Miss Bennett Crow doesn't just want the spring. He wants the whole north section. If he gets the water rights, he can cut Cal off from the summer grazing entirely, and the ranch fails by spring." Dell held her gaze. "He's been working on this for a year. You showing up with those deed records, that's the first thing that's put a wrench in his plans. Clara picked up the jar of preserved peaches again, turned it in her hands. He knows I found the records, she said. It was not a question. Word travels in a small town, Dell said. How? Dell's jaw tightened slightly. Somebody at the general store yesterday. I mentioned it without thinking. He looked at his hat. That was stupid of me. I'm sorry for it. It's done, Clara said. What matters now is what happens next. She looked at the jar in her hands and then set it down with a decisive small click. When does Crow typically make his move? Dell blinked. He'd clearly come in expecting a different kind of conversation. His pattern's been to wait until a man's at his lowest financially, personally. Then he shows up with papers already drawn. He'll be watching to see whether the talk in town drives me off, Clara said. Likely? Dell agreed. Then I'm not going to town tomorrow, Clara said. I'm going today, right now if you can drive. Dell stared at her. I need lard and dried beans and a spool of heavy thread, Clara said. And I need to be seen in Red Hollow buying those things without an apology on my face. If Crow wants to count on me slinking away quietly, he's going to be disappointed. A slow smile broke across Dell's face, gap-toothed and genuine, and the kind that meant he'd just decided something about a person. Supply wagon's already hitched, he said. I was going anyway. Give me 5 minutes, Clara said. She told Amos where she was going before she left. He was on the porch, his first time outside as far as she could tell, since before she arrived sitting in a straight-backed chair with his hands on his knees and his face in the morning sun. He didn't look at her when she came out, but the angle of his head changed, which meant he knew she was there. Going to town, she said. Need supplies. Back by afternoon. Amos was quiet for a moment. Crow's been talking, he said. Not a question. So I hear, Clara said. What are you going to do about it? Go buy my lard and beans in plain sight and let people draw their own conclusions, Clara said. Amos made a sound that was almost a laugh. Margaret used to say the best answer to a lie was to be so obviously yourself that the lie had nowhere to stand. Your wife was a wise woman, Clara said. Amos's hands tightened on his knees. She was the wisest person I've ever known, he said. And I've been sitting in that room letting Crow pick apart everything she helped build. His voice went flat and hard on the last sentence, with the flatness of a man who has just heard himself say a true thing he's been avoiding. You're on the porch now, Clara said. Amos looked out toward the pasture. So I am. That's a start, Clara said. A good one. She left him sitting in the sun and climbed up beside Dell on the supply wagon, and they went down the mountain toward Red Hollow. She felt the town before they reached it. That was the only way to describe it. Something in the quality of attention that a small town turns on a stranger, it has decided to talk about a specific alertness, a readiness to watch. Clara had grown up in a place like Red Hollow. She knew the feeling of being a subject. Dell pulled up at the general store and she climbed down without hesitation and went straight through the door. There were 4 women inside, 2 at the counter, 1 browsing the dry goods shelf, 1 near the window. Clara recognized one of them from Mrs. Aldrich's porch. The woman saw her at the same moment and said something quiet to the woman beside her without taking her eyes away. Clara walked to the counter. Good morning, she said to the man behind it, who was watching her with the careful neutrality of someone waiting to see how a situation developed. I need a pound of lard, 2 pounds of dried pinto beans, a spool of No. 8 thread, in black, and whatever dried sage you have in stock. Sage, he said. Cooking herb, Clara said pleasantly. There's a garden at the Whitaker Ranch that needs restocking. She felt the attention in the room sharpen. Let it. You're the woman Caleb Whitaker hired on, the man said. Clara Bennett, she said. Yes. Heard you came out here looking for work at Mrs. Aldrich's. I came out here because Mrs. Aldrich wrote me a letter offering me a position, Clara said, at a volume that made sure the whole room could hear it. She changed her mind when she saw me. Mr. Whitaker was good enough to offer honest work in its place. I'm grateful for it. She paused. The lard, please, and the beans. The man at the counter held her gaze for a moment and then turned to gather her order. The woman from the porch had moved closer. She was perhaps 50, sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to knowing things first. Silas Crow was in here this morning, she said. Not quite to Clara, not quite to the room. Somewhere in between. So I hear, Clara said. She did not look away from the counter. He said some things, the woman continued. People often do, Clara said. A short silence. Then the woman said, and her voice had changed slightly, taken on a less certain quality. Are the things he said true? Clara turned and looked at her directly. Which things, she said. The woman opened her mouth, closed it. The question when turned back that clearly apparently required more specificity than she'd expected. He said you showed up uninvited, the woman said, settling on a version. That you had no real position and just talked your way onto Cal Whitaker's property. I was offered a position, Clara said. In writing by Mrs. Aldrich and verbally by Mr. Whitaker on the street of this town yesterday morning in front of every person who cared to watch. She let that sit for a moment. If Mr. Crow was in this town yesterday morning, which I expect he was, he saw it happen. Another silence. Crow also said, the woman continued. She was clearly struggling now. Clara could see it. The woman had not anticipated having to defend the claims point by point that there's something not right about a woman who can't get hired at a decent house going to live on a man's ranch alone. There's nothing alone about it, Clara said. Mr. Whitaker's uncle lives in the house. His ranch hand is there daily. The position is housekeeper and cook, which is respectable work, and I have references from Hannibal, Missouri, if anyone requires them. She picked up the parcel the counterman had set in front of her, and the spool of thread, and turned to face the room properly. Mr. Crow is a man who wants something that belongs to the Whitaker family, and has not been able to get it by honest means. I would think carefully before carrying his words for him. She looked at each woman in the room, one at a time, unhurried. Good morning. She went out the door. Dell was waiting with the wagon. He had heard enough through the open window to be watching her with an expression that had moved decisively past neutral. Well, he said when she climbed up. Drive, Clara said, and he did. They were a mile out of town when she let herself breathe. Dell glanced at her sidelong. You all right? I'm fine, she said. Her hands were steady. She was mildly surprised to find this was true. You didn't have to do that, Dell said. Yes, I did, Clara said. Not for Crow's benefit, for mine. She looked at the road ahead. There's a difference between defending yourself because you're afraid and defending yourself because you've decided not to be moved. I wanted to decide. A pause. I've decided. Dell nodded slowly. Crow's going to be told you were there, and what you said. Good, Clara said. Dell was quiet for a moment. Cal's going to want to know. Then tell him, Clara said. I'd rather he hear it from you before someone else gets to it with their own additions. She had dinner on the stove by the time Caleb rode in from the north pasture. She heard him at the barn. The horse, the familiar sequence of sounds that meant a man was unsaddling and watering and doing the end-of-day things that bookend a working rancher's life. She kept her attention on the stew. She'd used the peaches for a cobbler baking in the cast-iron pan with a biscuit crust, and the smell of it had brought Amos back in from the porch and into the kitchen to sit and watch the oven, with the expression of a man being pulled somewhere against his better judgment. When Caleb came through the door, his eyes went to her first, and then to Amos at the table, and then to the cobbler's smell in that order. Dell told you, Clara said. Not a question. Dell told me, Caleb said. He was standing still in the doorway in a way that meant he was deciding something. You went into town. I needed supplies, Clara said. That's not all you did. No, Clara agreed. Caleb crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and sat down at the table. He put both hands flat on the surface the way Amos had done the night before and looked at her with an expression that was not angry. She would have known angry, but that had a concentrated intensity to it. The intensity of a man who has been informed of something and is working out how he feels about it. "You told the women in the general store that Crow is trying to take the ranch by dishonest means," he said. "I told them to think carefully before carrying his words for him," Clara said, "which is a different thing." "It amounts to the same. It amounts to the truth," Clara said. She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. "Mr. Whitaker, he was using gossip to make me leave and to make you look like a fool. If I'd stayed up here and said nothing, the story he was telling would have had no one to argue with it. Small-town stories only need one version if there's no other version available." She held his gaze. "I provided another version." Caleb looked at her for a long time. "You could have told me," he said. "Let me handle it." "You were checking fence line," Clara said. "And Crow moved this morning, not this afternoon. By the time you came down from the north pasture, the version he wanted would have been the one people were repeating over supper." She paused. "I can handle a room full of women in a general store, Mr. Whitaker. I don't need to wait on a man for that." Something moved in his expression. Not offense. Something closer to the look of a person being forced to recalibrate. "No," he said slowly. "I reckon you don't." Amos from his chair by the stove said nothing. But he was watching Caleb with an expression Clara recognized, the expression of an old man watching a younger man have a realization he's been waiting for. "There's something else," Clara said. Caleb waited. "Those survey markers in the deed box," Clara said. "There are annotations in the margins that I think came from a federal surveyor. If they're what I think they are, they're not just family records, they're legal documents. They would carry weight in a territorial court." The kitchen went very still. "Where did Amos get federal survey documents?" Caleb said. "I did the survey myself," Amos said. His voice when it came was quiet and iron underneath. 1871. "I applied to the Territorial Land Office and hired a federal surveyor to come out and establish the boundary properly. Paid for it myself." He folded his hands on the table. "Margaret said we should do it right or not at all. She said a day would come when we'd need that paper to be official." A pause. "I thought she was being cautious." "She was being right," Caleb said. Amos's jaw worked. "She usually was." Caleb turned back to Clara. "You looked at the survey document." "This afternoon while the cobbler was baking," Clara said. "The federal surveyor's seal is on the original. It's dated September 12, 1871, and it establishes the north boundary of this property, including the spring clearly and specifically." She paused. "If Crow is filing documents that contradict a federally registered survey, he's not just being dishonest. He's committing fraud against the territorial government." The word landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped in still water. Caleb sat back. "That's a federal crime," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." Another silence. The stew simmered. The cobbler had gone golden and still in the cast iron pan. "He doesn't know we have the survey," Caleb said slowly. "He knows about the deed records," Clara said. "Dell mentioned them in town. But there's a difference between knowing a family has old records and knowing those records include a federal survey with a government seal." She met Caleb's eyes. "He's moving because he thinks he still has time. Because he thinks the gossip will drive me off, and without me, he'll have cleared the obstacle." Caleb looked at her steadily. "Are you going to leave?" Clara pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and looked at him with the same directness she had given the women in the general store. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "Silas Crow did not ride me out of Red Hollow this morning. I very much doubt he's going to manage it from a distance." Caleb was quiet for a long beat. Then he said, "What do you think we should do?" We landed between them without ceremony, without being marked or noted. Clara didn't comment on it. She reached past him and picked up her mother's journal where she'd been keeping her own notes in the back pages. "I think we need to write to the Territorial Land Office," she said. "Register that the survey document exists and that a claim has been made against it. That way, if Crow files papers before we can act, there's already a formal record." She paused. "I also think we need a lawyer. Not to fight, to write a letter. The right letter sent to the right place with a copy of the survey seal attached will make Crow very uncomfortable." "There's no lawyer in Red Hollow," Caleb said. "There's one in Glenwood Springs," Amos said. Both Clara and Caleb looked at him. He hadn't moved from his chair. "Henry Marsh. Good man. I used him when I first filed the deed." Margaret kept his address in her correspondence box. "Where's the correspondence box?" Caleb asked. Amos was quiet for a moment. "Bedroom," he said. "On the shelf above the window." Caleb looked at his uncle. Something passed between them, quick and heavy, the specific weight of two men who have been through a great deal together and have learned to communicate across it with minimum words. "I'll get it," Amos said. He pushed himself up from the chair. "I know where everything is." He walked back through the hallway door. The sound of his footsteps was steadier than they'd been that morning, Clara noticed. Not dramatically steadier, but enough. They found Henry Marsh's address at the bottom of a bundle of letters tied with kitchen string in a correspondence box that also contained, among other things, a dried rosemary sprig and a folded piece of paper with a recipe for apple cake written in a handwriting that was not Amos's. Clara recognized the careful writing of a woman who kept records of things that mattered and never let anyone tell her those things didn't count. She didn't say anything about it. She passed the correspondence box back to Amos and turned to the clean page at the back of her mother's journal. "I'll draft the letter," she said. "Someone else should write the clean copy. My handwriting is fine, but a letter like this should come from you." She looked at Caleb. "Either of you." "Amos writes better than I do," Caleb said. "I'll write it," Amos said. He said it with a directness that had not been there yesterday, with something underneath it that was, if not quite purpose, then the beginning of purpose's return. They worked at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour, Clara drafting, suggesting, crossing out, and starting again. Amos asking questions, correcting details, adding the precise legal language of a man who had done this once before and remembered it. Caleb listening, reading occasionally, saying a quiet word that settled something that had been at an angle. It was the most sustained conversation the three of them had had. Clara was aware of it, the way she was aware of the survey document, and the cobbler on the stove, and the open window letting in the night air, not separately, but as one continuous thing, the whole shape of what was happening in this kitchen and this house. When the letter was finished, and Amos's copy was written out clean on the good paper Clara had found in the correspondence box, Caleb read it through one more time in silence. "This is right," he said. "This is exactly right." He looked at Clara. "Dell can take it to Glenwood Springs first thing tomorrow," Clara said. "It's a day's ride each way, but if he leaves at dawn, he can be back by nightfall the day after." Caleb nodded, looked at the letter again, then looked at Clara with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, not his working problem expression, not his careful, quiet expression. Something that was simpler and less guarded than either, and because of that more difficult to look at directly. "I need to say something," he said. "All right," Clara said. "When I found you in Red Hollow yesterday," he said, "I offered you work because I needed the help, and you were standing there, and it seemed like the right thing. I didn't think past that morning." He paused. "I've been thinking about it since." Clara waited. "I don't know how to run a house," Caleb said. "I know how to work a ranch. I know how to fix a fence and read weather and push cattle through a mountain pass. But I have been watching my uncle disappear for 3 years, and I didn't know how to stop it, and I had records in my own pantry that I didn't know to look for. And a man has been building a legal case against me for the better part of a year. And it took a woman I'd known for less than 24 hours to make me see the shape of it clearly." His voice was level. He wasn't asking for reassurance or performing humility. He was simply saying a thing that was true. "That's not a failing," Clara said. "I know it's not," he said. "That's not what I'm saying." He looked at the letter on the table. "What I'm saying is that I misjudged the situation. I thought I was doing a small kindness. I didn't reckon on—" He stopped. "On what?" Clara said. He looked at her. "On any of this," he said simply. She held his gaze. "Neither did I," she said. Amos, who had been sitting very quietly through all of this, picked up his cobbler bowl and tapped it twice on the table with a sound that meant he would like some more please, and was choosing this moment to make that clear. Clara got up to serve him. The particular thread of the moment stretched and held and changed into something else without breaking. She was washing up alone when the sound came from outside. She had sent Caleb to bed. He had a 5 o'clock start. Dell had told her for the summer, cattle count on the upper pasture, and Amos had gone back to his room an hour ago. The kitchen was hers, the quiet was hers, and she was standing at the basin in the lamplight when she heard it. A horse. On the road below the house. Moving at a pace that wasn't traveling, stopping, waiting, then moving again. Not Dell. Dell had gone home. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night, and there was no reason for anyone to be on the road to the Whitaker Ranch at 10 o'clock at night, except one kind of reason, and that kind of reason did not announce itself. Clara dried her hands. She looked at the lamp for a moment, then turned it down, low, not out, but low, and moved to the kitchen window, and stood to one side of it, and listened. The horse sound stopped. Silence for a long stretch, longer than felt natural. Then in the outer dark, where the kitchen lamplight didn't reach, she heard the sound of boots on dry ground. Moving toward the root cellar. Clara did not call out. She did not wake Caleb. She did not do any of the things that fear would have suggested. She thought about what Silas Crow wanted. She thought about what was in the root cellar, the preserves, the lord, the dried herbs. And then she thought about what was not in the root cellar, but what a man who'd heard about deed records and federal surveys might go looking for in the dark on a property he was trying to take. She picked up the lantern from the corner shelf, turned it up fully, walked out the kitchen door and around the side of the house with it held high. "Can I help you?" she said. The man at the root cellar door was not Silas Crow. He was younger hired hand of some kind she judged in his 20s, with a start in him at the light that said he had absolutely expected the house to be dark and quiet. He straightened up fast. "Lost my way," he said. "On a road with one ranch on it," Clara said pleasantly. "That's unfortunate." She held the lantern steady and kept her voice the same even level she'd used in the general store. "The road back to Red Hollow is north from the front gate. You passed it coming up." He looked at her, looked at the root cellar door, looked at the lantern. "Ma'am," he started. "The root cellar has preserves and kitchen supplies," Clara said. "If that's what you came for, you're welcome to go back and tell whoever sent you." She took one step toward him, just one, deliberate. "And you can also tell him that the records he's looking for are not in the root cellar. They're in a letter on their way to Henry Marsh in Glenwood Springs, and a copy will be registered with the Territorial Land Office by the end of the week." The man went very still. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the front gate, and Clara listened to his horse move down the dark road until the sound disappeared completely. She stood for a moment in the cooling night air, with the lantern in her hand. Then she went back inside. She banked the stove, double-checked the kitchen door latch and the front door and the cellar. She set the lantern on the table and sat down with her mother's journal and wrote 3 lines in the back pages, the date, the time, and a brief, precise description of what had occurred, because her mother had taught her that a woman should keep records of things that mattered, and because Margaret Whitaker had understood the same thing, and because sometimes the truth you can prove is the only truth that counts. She closed the journal. The ranch held its shape around her in the dark stone and timber and herb garden and spring, and a letter on the kitchen table that hadn't been there yesterday, and an old man sleeping in a room whose door was open for the first time in 3 years. Silas Crow had sent someone to find what she had. What he hadn't counted on was that she'd already sent it away. Clara told Caleb about the night visitor over breakfast. She did it the way she did most things, directly, without preamble, while she was pouring his coffee and Amos was already at the table with his hands around his cup. She set the journal open to her 3 lines of notes from the night before and put it beside his plate. Caleb read it. He read it twice. Then he set the journal down and picked up his coffee and drank from it slowly, and the slowness of it was not calm. It was the deliberate management of something that wanted to move faster than he was going to let it. "You went outside alone," he said. "I did," Clara said. "In the dark." "I had the lantern." Caleb set the cup down. His jaw was set in a way she'd learned to read as the outer surface of an emotion he was keeping below the surface. "You should have woken me," he said. "There wasn't time to weigh the options," Clara said. "He was at the root cellar. If I'd gone to your room and back, he'd have been inside it." "I don't care about the root cellar." "You should," Clara said. "Because if he'd found the deed box was gone from the pantry and started looking elsewhere, the root cellar is exactly where a man in a hurry might think to look next." She met his eyes steadily. "I handled it, Mr. Whitaker." The situation called for a steady light and a calm voice, not a confrontation. He left. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "He told Crow about the letter," he said. "Of course he did," Clara said. "That was the point. Now Crow knows the letter exists and that it's already moving." She sat down across from him. "A man planning fraud needs time and silence. We've taken both away from him." Amos made a quiet sound from his end of the table. "She's not wrong," he said. Caleb looked at his uncle, then back at Clara, then at the journal. "Dell leaves at first light," he said. "He was ready last night," Clara said. "He'll be in Glenwood Springs before noon." Caleb nodded once. He picked up his fork. He ate in silence for a few minutes, and Clara watched the line of his shoulders slowly not relax. Caleb Whitaker didn't relax exactly, but settle the way a mountain settles after a shift, finding its new position, holding it. "You wrote down what the man looked like," Caleb said. "Brown coat, young, maybe 24. Gap in his left eyebrow like an old scar. Good boots, not a working man's boots." She paused. "Hired." Caleb's eyes sharpened. "Not one of Crow's regular hands." "No," Clara said. "Someone brought in for the purpose." Another silence. "That means Crow's moving faster than I thought," Caleb said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "Which means we need to move faster than he expected." Ted. Dell left before sunrise. Caleb saw him off at the gate, and Clara watched from the kitchen window, and Amos stood on the porch with his coffee and his new habit of being outside, which he had apparently decided to maintain without being asked. The sound of Dell's horse on the downhill road faded, and then the 3 of them were alone on the ranch with the summer morning coming in fast and bright and the north pasture shining in the early light. Caleb came back into the kitchen with the particular expression of a man who has done what he can do about the things that can be managed from a distance and is now turning his attention to the things that are close. "I want to walk the north boundary today," he said. "Look at the spring markers myself." He looked at Clara. "I want you to come." She hadn't expected that. "Me? You read the survey document," he said. "You know where the markers should be. I know the land, but I want someone who knows the legal description walking it with me." He paused. "Unless you have things here that need—" "The bread is already done," Clara said. "The stew can wait." She was already untying her apron. Amos from the porch doorway. "I'll keep the fire." Caleb looked at his uncle. Something in his face moved brief, unguarded. "You sure? I kept this fire for 40 years before you were old enough to manage a stove," Amos said. "I reckon I remember how." Caleb put his hat on. "Then let's go." The north pasture was 40 minutes from the house on foot, cutting across the high summer grass and through the stand of aspen that marked the midpoint of the property. Clara had tucked her mother's journal under her arm with the survey notes she'd copied into the back pages, and she kept pace with Caleb. Without difficulty, she had never been a woman who needed a slower pace set for her, and he didn't offer one. They didn't talk much on the walk out. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the morning didn't seem to require it. And Clara had learned that Caleb Whitaker's silences were not uncomfortable things. They had texture to them. They were the silences of a man who was present in a full way, attending to what was around him, thinking without making a performance of thought. She appreciated it more than she would have expected to. "How long has this been your land?" she asked when they reached the aspen stand. "My grandfather settled it," Caleb said. 1854. He came from Tennessee with 2 horses and no money and more stubbornness than was probably advisable. A pause. "Amos was born here. It was Amos's land before it was mine. He signed it over when his knees went bad 3 winters before Margaret died. Said he'd rather do it while he could still hold a pen than wait until there was no choice." "He trusted you," Clara said. "He trusted me with the land," Caleb said. "With the rest." He stopped walking for a moment. Not because the terrain required it. "When Margaret died, I didn't know how to reach him. I tried for a while. He didn't want reaching." His voice was matter-of-fact. "Eventually, I stopped trying as hard as I should have. I kept the ranch going and I let the house go cold, and I told myself that was the most I could do." He started walking again. It wasn't. Clara walked beside him and said nothing and let him have the truth of it without commentary. Some things didn't need response, they needed witness. "He's on the porch in the mornings now," she said after a while. "I noticed," Caleb said. "He talks about Margaret more each day. That's a good sign. Grief that stays silent festers. Grief that can be spoken starts to move." Caleb glanced at her sidelong. "You know a lot about grief for someone your age." "I'm 29, Clara said. "Not 16. I've buried my mother and my father and a younger brother who didn't make it past his 3rd winter." She said it evenly, the way she said most difficult things. "Grief and I are well acquainted." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "So am I," Clara said. "But I'm still here. That counts for something." He looked at her, then really looked the way he'd looked at her in Red Hollow on the street, the quick, sharp survey that took everything in. But this time, it was slower. Like he was looking at something he was trying to understand rather than assess. "It counts for a great deal," he said. They reached the spring at the edge of the north boundary 40 minutes later, and what Caleb found there stopped him dead. Clara nearly walked into his back. "What is it?" she said. He crouched down beside a flat-topped boulder at the edge of the spring's outlet. She crouched beside him. The rock had been marked in old marking weathered that matched the description in the survey document exactly. Federal Survey mark chiseled notation, the specific code she'd copied into her journal notes. Beside it, driven into the ground so recently that the dirt around it was still loose and raw, was a new stake. Iron painted red, with a different notation scratched into its surface. Caleb looked at the stake. He did not touch it. "That wasn't here a week ago," he said. Clara pulled out her journal and found the survey description. "The federal marker establishes this rock as the north boundary point," she said. "The spring falls 30 feet inside that line." She looked at the new stake. "This stake puts the boundary 30 feet south. If this stake is what Crow files on, the spring falls outside your property." Caleb stood up. He looked out over the spring and the open ground beyond it. "He already came onto my land," he said. The flatness in his voice was something she hadn't heard before. Not the flatness of management, but of fury, held very still and very tight. "He did," Clara said. "Or someone he sent." "Same thing," Caleb said. "Yes," she agreed. "Same thing." She stood up beside him. "Don't pull it out." He looked at her. "Leave the stake," she said. "It's evidence. It shows exactly what he's claiming and exactly where he put it. If you pull it out, it's your word against his, that it was ever there." She met his eyes. "Take a measurement from the federal marker to the stake. Write it down in my journal right now with both our names on it." He looked at the stake for a long moment. Then he reached out and took the journal from her hands and wrote the measurement in his own careful rancher's hand, the distance, the direction, the date, the description of the stake and its markings. He wrote it slowly and precisely, the way a man writes something he knows he'll need to be able to swear to. He handed the journal back to her. "There may be more," he said. They walked the full length of the north boundary. They found 2 more stakes, each one placed with the same deliberate precision, each one cutting the boundary line south by a consistent margin that, taken together, would move Crow's claimed line 30 feet inside Caleb's surveyed property at every point. Clara documented all of it. Every stake, every measurement, every deviation from the federal survey markers that had stood unchallengeable since 1871. By the time they turned back toward the house, the summer sun was past the midpoint of the sky, and Caleb Whitaker had the expression of a man who has been pushed past the point of patience and has arrived somewhere quieter and more dangerous on the other side. They were halfway back through the aspen stand when they heard the horse. Both of them stopped at the same moment. The sound was coming from the main road, not the back trail, the main road, and it was moving fast, moving with the urgency of someone who had a purpose and was not being subtle about it. "That's more than one horse," Clara said. Caleb was already moving. Not running, he didn't run, but moving with a speed that his usual deliberate walk didn't suggest he had, and Clara matched it without being asked, because this was not the time to be anywhere except where the trouble was going. They came out of the aspen stand to see 3 riders turning into the front gate of the ranch. The man in front was someone Clara had not seen before, but she recognized his type immediately and completely, the type of man who wears his authority like a garment he has tailored specifically to intimidate. Broad, well-dressed for a ranch road, riding a horse that cost more than most men in Red Hollow made in 6 months. He had the look of a man who had decided in advance how this encounter would go. Silas Crow. The 2 men behind him were larger, quieter. The kind of hired muscle that exists to be noticed rather than to act. The statement of them was the point. Amos was on the porch. He hadn't run. He hadn't retreated. He was standing at the top of the porch steps, with both hands at his sides, watching the riders come through the gate, with an expression that Clara recognized from the kitchen. The expression of a man who has found something in himself he thought was gone. Caleb walked to the front of the porch in 7 strides. Clara stayed 2 steps behind him and to the right. Not behind him, beside him, positioned to be visible. Crow pulled his horse up at the foot of the porch steps. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Amos. He looked at Clara with the specific contempt of a man who has already decided what she is. "Whitaker," he said. His voice was smooth and unhurried. The voice of a man who believed this was already over. "I've come to have a conversation about the north pasture." "We're not much for conversations about property that isn't yours," Caleb said. His voice was the flattest Clara had heard it. Crow smiled. "Well, now that's what I've come to discuss. There seems to be a difference of opinion on that point." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I have a survey from the county office that establishes my claim to the north boundary line. I thought we might discuss it neighborly before things get formal." "Show me the survey," Caleb said. Crow handed it down. Caleb opened it, read it, and passed it to Clara without comment. She read it fast and carefully. County Survey Office letterhead, dated 3 weeks ago. A boundary description that matched the stakes they'd found that morning. Exactly, which meant those stakes had not been placed before this survey. They had been placed to match a document that had already been filed. The fraud was not being assembled. It was already assembled. She looked up. Crow was watching her. "I'm not sure what the hired help's opinion is relevant to," he said. "She's reading the survey," Caleb said. "Miss Bennett reads survey documents. I trust her judgment." Something flickered in Crow's expression. Quickly gone. "A woman who can't get hired on at a decent establishment reading legal documents. That's very modern of you, Cal." "Mr. Whitaker," Caleb said. His voice had not changed in pitch or speed, but something in it had moved about 12 degrees colder. "And the document is fraudulent." Crow's smile didn't waver. "That's a serious word." "It's a serious situation," Caleb said. "We walked the north boundary this morning. Your stakes are in the ground." He watched Crow's expression for the flicker of surprise and saw it and continued before Crow could speak. "We documented every one of them. Measurement from the Federal Survey marker's direction date description. Both our names on the record. A beat. Federal survey markers, Crow said. 1871, Caleb said. Registered with the Territorial Land Office. My uncle hired a federal surveyor to establish the boundary legally, and it's been on record for 12 years. He paused. We wrote to Henry Marsh in Glenwood Springs yesterday. Letter went out this morning, along with a copy of the federal survey document. Crow looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. Clara. The county survey you've filed, she said, keeping her voice level and even, contradicts a registered federal survey. That's not a difference of opinion about property lines. That's fraud against the territorial government. She paused. I'd think very carefully, Mr. Crow, about whether you want to continue this conversation on these particular grounds. Silence. One of the men behind Crow shifted in his saddle. Crow did not shift, but something behind his eyes had moved a calculation rapid and unwanted. You're a cook, he said to Clara. His voice had lost its smoothness, just slightly. You have no standing here. She has standing anywhere I give it, Caleb said, and I give it here, on my land. It won't be your land much. Enough. The word came from the porch, not loud, but it cut through the argument the way a blade cuts cleanly with authority, without waste. Amos had stepped to the front of the porch railing. He was not a physically imposing man anymore, not with the weight he'd lost. But he stood with the bearing of a man who had built something and intended to keep it, and there was something in him at that moment that was older and harder than Crow's smooth authority. I settled this land in 1854, Amos said. I have paid taxes on it, surveyed it legally, improved it, and built on it for 30 years. I have the documents to prove every acre and every boundary and every water right we hold. His voice was quiet and absolute. My wife kept those records. She kept them specifically for a day like this one, when a man would come riding up to this porch and try to take with paper what he couldn't take with honest dealing. He looked at Crow with the direct, uncomplicated look of a man who has finished being afraid. You will get off this property, and then you will withdraw that county filing. And if you don't, I will be in Glenwood Springs personally to walk Henry Marsh through every federal document we hold, and I will ask him to send them directly to the Territorial Governor's Office, which has a particular interest in land fraud against registered federal claims. The silence after that was the loudest silence Clara had heard since she'd arrived. Crow looked at Amos, at Caleb, at Clara, at the document in Clara's hand. This isn't over, he said. No. Amos agreed. It isn't, but it will be. A pause. Good day, Mr. Crow. Crow pulled his horse around. The two men behind him followed. They went back through the gate at a trot, and the sound of them diminished down the mountain road, and the three of them stood in the sudden quiet. Amos on the porch, Caleb at the foot of the steps, Clara beside him, with the fraudulent document still in her hand. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Caleb turned and looked at his uncle on the porch, and Amos looked back at him. And something passed between them that was 30 years long and didn't need a word to carry it. Clara folded the document carefully and put it in her journal. I'll get dinner started, she said. Dinner was a quieter affair than it should have been given what had happened, and Clara understood why. The confrontation had gone well better than expected, but the shape of what was coming next had not changed. Crow had been surprised, but not defeated. Men like Crow didn't come back from surprise easily, and they rarely came back straightforwardly. She put the stew on and thought about it while she worked. Amos ate with the appetite of a man who had been reintroduced to the feeling of his own usefulness, which was, Clara had observed, the best appetite there was. He had thirds of the stew and did not pretend otherwise. Caleb ate and said little, and she could see the thinking going on behind his eyes, the same turning over process she'd been doing herself, except his was about the physical landscape and hers was about the human one. He'll file a response to Marsh's letter before we can get there, Caleb said. He'll try, Clara said, but he doesn't know what's in the letter. He'll know we contacted Marsh. Knowing and knowing the contents are different things. Clara sat down and poured herself coffee and looked at the fraudulent survey document she'd set on the table corner. He also doesn't know about the stakes. He knows we found them, Caleb said. I told him. You told him we documented them, Clara said. That's different from knowing the exact measurements and the precise deviation from the federal markers. She paused. If he sends someone to move those stakes before we can get a formal witness out there, our documentation is the only record they were ever there. Caleb looked at her. You want a witness? I want a witness with authority, Clara said. Not just Dell, someone from town, someone whose word carries in a courtroom. Doc Purvis, Amos said. Both Clara and Caleb looked at him. Henry Purvis has been a justice of the peace in Red Hollow for 15 years, Amos said. Before he was a doctor, he was a surveyor. He'd know exactly what he was looking at, and his witness signature carries judicial weight in the territorial court. He folded his hands. He and Margaret were friends. He'll come if I ask him. Caleb looked at his uncle with an expression Clara had not seen him wear before open, and something that was close to relief. Can you write him tonight? Caleb said. Already planning to, Amos said. I can't. The second letter went out with the dawn. Clara was up before Amos, and Amos was up before Caleb, and by the time the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, the kitchen was warm, and the letters were ready, and the morning had the focused, purposeful quality of days when everything that can be done is being done. The knock at the door came 3 hours later, not a knock, a hammering. The kind that doesn't wait for an answer to be invited. Clara was at the kitchen table copying the stake measurements into a clean document when it came, and she was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move. She opened the door. The woman standing on the porch was not someone she recognized, and that alone was notable. Clara had now seen most of the faces that came to the Whitaker Ranch, and this one didn't belong to any of them. She was perhaps 40, travel-dusty, with the compact efficiency of someone who had ridden hard and recently, and her eyes were the eyes of a woman carrying something urgent. I'm looking for Miss Bennett, she said. Clara blinked. I'm Clara Bennett. The woman looked at her steadily. My name is Frances Holt. I'm a correspondent for the Colorado Territorial Gazette. I've been covering Silas Crow's land dealings in this county for 8 months. She paused. I heard this morning that someone finally has documentation. Clara stood very still. How did you hear that? She said. Red Hollow is a small town, Frances Holt said. And I was in the general store yesterday when a woman told the story of a composed young housekeeper who suggested people think carefully before carrying a land agent's words for him. She held Clara's gaze. That was enough to make me come up the mountain. Clara looked at her for a long moment. She heard Caleb's boots in the hallway behind her. Who is it? He said. Clara stepped back from the door. Come in, Miss Holt, she said. There's coffee on the stove. You'll want to sit down for this. Frances Holt was the kind of woman Clara recognized instinctively, the kind who had gotten where she was by being smarter and faster and more prepared than anyone expected, and who had learned to wear that capability quietly, because the world responded better when it didn't feel outmaneuvered. She drank her coffee and listened to all of it without interrupting, which was its own kind of impressive. She asked her questions after sharp, specific, the questions of someone who already understood the legal framework and wanted the particular facts to fill the spaces in it. The federal survey, she said. You have the original document. We have it, Amos said. The stakes on the north boundary. Documented this morning, Clara said. Measurements and descriptions witnessed by both Mr. Whitaker and myself. The fraudulent county survey. Clara set it on the table. Frances Holt looked at it without touching it, reading it with the focused attention of a woman who had looked at a great many documents. This is Crow's third filing in this county in 4 years, she said. The other 2 went unchallenged because the property owners didn't have the documentation or the knowledge to contest them. Her eyes moved to Clara. You're not from here. Missouri, Clara said. And you found the survey documents in the pantry. In the pantry, Clara confirmed. Frances Holt looked at Caleb. She found what you couldn't. She found what I didn't know to look for, Caleb said. There was no defensiveness in it, just the plain fact. Frances Holt sat back. If I publish this story, the federal survey, the forged stakes, the county filing the documented evidence, Crow loses his ability to operate in this territory. The territorial governor's office will have to respond. Henry Marsh will have grounds to file for dismissal of the county claim and an investigation into the original filing. And Crow, Caleb said. Fraud against a federally registered survey is a federal matter, Francis said. He'd be looking at prosecution. Silence around the table. Why are you telling us this before you publish it? Clara said. Francis looked at her. A quick approving look. Because I need your consent to use the documents, and because I want you to know what the consequences will be before you decide. She paused. Once this is in print, Crow will know it's over. Men who know it's over sometimes do unpredictable things. Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at Caleb. We already sent word to Henry Marsh, Caleb said. I know, Francis said. I stopped in Glenwood Springs on my way here. Marsh is moving quickly. She held Caleb's gaze. The story accelerates that, makes it public, makes it harder to bury. Another silence. Amos set his coffee cup down with a deliberate small sound. My wife spent 30 years keeping records so this ranch would survive after she was gone, he said. His voice was steady and clear in the way that voices go clear when a person has arrived at the far side of something they've been carrying. If those records can put Silas Crow where he belongs, then publish the story. He looked at Caleb. It's what she would have wanted. Caleb held his uncle's gaze for a long moment. Then he turned to Francis Holt. You have our consent, he said. Francis Holt pulled a reporter's notebook from her coat. She uncapped her pen. She looked at Clara. Start from the beginning, she said. Tell me everything. Clara talked for 2 hours. She was precise. She was sequential. She gave dates and times and measurements. She produced the journal with her notes and the survey copies and the measured descriptions of each stake. She was the kind of witness a journalist and a lawyer both needed, one who understood what was relevant and said it plainly and didn't embellish. Caleb listened to all of it from his chair at the table and said nothing, and Clara was aware of his listening the way she was aware of the fire as a steady, sustaining presence at her back. When she was done, Francis Holt put her notebook away and stood. The story will run in 3 days, she said. I'll send a copy to Henry Marsh and one to the governor's territorial office on my way back through Glenwood Springs. She paused at the door. Miss Bennett, where did you come from before Red Hollow? Hannibal, Missouri, Clara said. And before this work? Before this work, I was looking for a place where what I knew how to do mattered, Clara said. Francis Holt held her gaze for a moment with an expression that was professionally neutral, but had something else running underneath it. You found it, she said. And then she was out the door and on her horse and moving down the mountain road. The afternoon came in quietly after that. Too quietly. Clara recognized the quiet. It was the specific quiet that settles between a thing being set in motion and its consequences arriving. The machinery had been engaged. Now they waited. She was restocking the root cellar, carrying up jars and putting them in their places, when she heard Caleb on the steps behind her. You should have told me about the reporter, he said. Clara looked up from the crate she was unpacking. I found out when you did. A pause. That's true. He sat down on the top cellar step, which brought him to roughly her eye level. You handled all of that without stopping to check whether I was comfortable with it. You were in the room, Clara said. If you'd wanted to stop it, you could have. She looked at him directly. Did you want to stop it? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Then what's the concern? Another pause. Longer this time. She had learned to wait through Caleb's longer pauses because they were the ones that produced something real. I keep feeling like I should be driving this, he said. It's my ranch, my family's land, my uncle. He looked at his hands. And I keep finding that you've already done the next thing before I've worked out what the next thing is. Clara set the jar she was holding down carefully. I'm not trying to run your ranch, she said. I know that. I'm trying to help you keep it. I know that too. He looked up. That's not what I'm... He stopped. Tried again. Clara. The use of her name without the miss the first time sat in the air between them with a weight it apparently hadn't planned on carrying. He seemed aware of it. He kept going anyway. When I picked you up off that street in Red Hollow, I thought I was doing you a kindness. I thought you were a woman in a difficult situation who needed work, and I needed help. That's exactly what it was, Clara said. It stopped being only that sometime around when you found the deed records, he said. His voice was even and careful, a man picking his way through unfamiliar terrain with full attention. And I don't know exactly what it is now, but I know it's not only what I thought it was when I started. The root cellar was very quiet. Clara looked at him for a long moment, at the hard, weathered face and the honest eyes, and the hands that had written those measurements into her journal with such deliberate precision. I don't know exactly what it is either, she said, but I think that's all right for now. Something in him settled. Not resolved, just settled the way things settle when they've found a position they can hold while the rest of the situation works itself out. For now, he agreed. The trouble came back at dusk. Clara heard the horses first. Multiple moving fast, and she was at the kitchen window before the thought had fully formed. 3 riders on the road below, moving uphill with the urgency that had no good origin at this hour of day. Not Crow. She was sure of that. Crow had gone back to consider his position. These riders had a different energy, hired and purposeful, and not bothering with the pretense of a conversation. Caleb, she said. He was already in the doorway behind her. He'd heard it too. Amos, he said, turning toward the hallway. Get away from the windows! Amos appeared in the hallway entrance. He took one look at Caleb's expression and moved without argument toward the inner room. Clara looked at the deed box on the table, at the fraudulent survey document, at her journal with 3 days' worth of documentation. If they're here to take the documents, she started. They're not getting them, Caleb said. No, Clara agreed. But we should split them. She was already moving, pulling the journal, separating the survey copy from the county filing, wrapping the federal document in the kitchen cloth, and tucking it inside Margaret's correspondence box. If something happens, not everything should be in the same place. She handed Caleb the correspondence box. He took it without question. There's a loose board in the floor of the barn, he said. Dell knows it. Go, Clara said. He looked at her. The look lasted 1 second, which was long for Caleb Whitaker, and said several things that neither of them had words for yet. Then he was out the back door with the box moving fast and low, and Clara was turning to face the front of the house with her journal in her hands, and her mother's voice in her head, saying what it had always said when things got hard. Stand your ground. Keep your records. Don't you let anyone tell you what you know isn't worth knowing. The horses reached the gate. Clara straightened her spine. She breathed through her nose, and she went to open the front door before they could decide whether to knock. There were 3 of them at the gate, and none of them were Crow. Clara had known that before she opened the door. She had known it by the sound of them, the particular urgency of men sent to do something specific, not men arriving to negotiate. Crow negotiated. What he sent when negotiation had failed was a different instrument entirely. The man in front was the one with authority. Not physical authority that belonged to the larger man on his left, who had the build of someone hired specifically for situations where size was the argument. The authority on the lead man was the paper kind. He was holding a document in his hand the way a man holds a weapon he expects to be enough. This the Whitaker ranch, he said. It is, Clara said. She stood in the door frame with the lamp behind her and her journal under her arm and her voice at its most even. Can I help you? I need to speak with Caleb Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker is occupied, Clara said. I'm the housekeeper. What's your business? The man looked at her with the faint irritation of someone who had expected a different kind of obstacle. I have a notice of preliminary injunction from the Red Hollow County Court. It requires the occupant of this property to cease interference with the survey process on the north boundary of the property described herein. He held out the paper. I need this signed as received. Clara took the paper. She read it. She read it the way she read everything fully, not skimming, registering every word in its particular place. The injunction was signed by a county judge. It named Caleb Whitaker specifically. It claimed that the placement of documentation markers near the north boundary constituted interference with a legitimate county survey. It required him to refrain from approaching the north boundary until the county survey was formally resolved. She looked up. This was filed today, she said. This afternoon, the man confirmed. The county court is in session on Wednesdays, Clara said. Today is Thursday. A flicker. The judge convened a special session. For a boundary dispute, Clara said. For an injunction request from a property claimant with standing. Clara looked at the paper again. Then she looked at the man. Who is the judge? She said. Another flicker, smaller, quicker. Judge Alderman. Clara filed that name. I'll make sure Mr. Whitaker receives this, she said. Is there anything else? The man looked past her into the house with the transparent intention of someone trying to assess what was inside. The injunction requires acknowledgement tonight. You have my acknowledgement that it's been received, Clara said. That satisfies the service requirement. Mr. Whitaker will review it and respond through his legal representative. She paused. Good evening. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she moved. Caleb came back through the kitchen door 4 minutes later, breathing slightly faster than usual, with dirt on his knees from the barn floor. He stopped when he saw her at the table, with the injunction spread open in front of her. What is it? He said. Court injunction, she said, signed by a Judge Alderman, filed today in what they're calling a special session. It bars you from approaching the north boundary while the county survey is under dispute. She looked up. It also categorizes our documentation work this morning as interference with a legitimate survey. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down. He read the injunction himself, and his jaw tightened progressively as he moved through it. Alderman, he said. You know him. He plays cards with Crow on Friday nights. His voice was flat and precise. Has for years. There it is, Clara said. Caleb set the paper down. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man assessing damage, not panicking, not despairing, but calculating with great seriousness. If I can't go near the north boundary, he said, Crow can move those stakes before Doc Purvis gets here to witness them. Yes, Clara said. And without the stakes in their original position, our measurements become testimony rather than physical evidence, Clara said. Still valuable, but more contestable. She looked at the injunction again. The injunction covers you. It names you specifically. Caleb caught the specific weight she'd put on that. He looked at her. It doesn't name me, Clara said. Silence. Clara, he said. I am the housekeeper, she said. I am not a party to the property dispute. I am not named in the injunction. If I were to walk to the north boundary tonight and photograph, or rather to document with additional witnesses, the current position of those stakes before they're moved, there is nothing in that document that prevents it. It's dark, Caleb said. Not completely, Clara said. And I know where the stakes are. I documented them this morning. You're not going up there alone. I wasn't planning to, Clara said. I was planning to take Amos. Caleb stared at her. He's not named in the injunction either, Clara said. And he knows that land better than anyone alive. She paused. He's also been sitting on that porch every morning looking like a man who has been waiting for something worth doing. From the hallway, with a timing that suggested he had been listening for at least the last minute, Amos said, I'll get my coat. They left within the hour, Amos with a lantern and his knowledge of every step of that land, Clara with her journal and the precise notes she'd made that morning, and a stubbornness that had gotten her this far and showed no sign of diminishing. Caleb stood at the porch railing and watched them go with an expression that Clara did not look back to read, because if she had, she might have lost some of the forward momentum she needed, and forward momentum was currently the most valuable thing she had. The night was warm and still, the summer dark broken by starlight, and the lantern Amos carried with the ease of a man who had walked this land in darkness more times than he could count. He didn't stumble once. He moved through the aspen stand and across the high grass with a sureness that had nothing to do with his recent weeks of stillness. It was the sureness of a man whose body remembered what his grief had tried to make him forget. This land was in his feet. It was in his hands. It was the thing Margaret had helped him build, and that he had been letting Crow pick apart from a distance, while he sat in a dark room and called it morning. He walked like a man who had decided that was over. "How much further?" Clara said. 10 minutes, Amos said. "Maybe 8 at your pace." She took that as a compliment and kept moving. They found the first stake exactly where her notes said it was. Amos held the lantern close and looked at it with the eyes of a man who had put survey markers in this ground himself. "That's not on any line I established," he said. "No," Clara said. She opened her journal and began writing the time, the date, the position, the measurement from the federal marker. "Can you tell me in your own words what you observe?" Amos looked at her sideways. "I'm creating a second record," she said. "Yours. If this goes before a territorial court, a second independent account from the original property owner is significant." Amos was quiet for a moment. Then, in the careful, measured voice of a man who had once handled legal documents and knew what language they required. "This stake is positioned approximately 30 feet south of the federal survey marker, establishing the north boundary of this property. The marker itself," he gestured with the lantern, "is clearly visible and intact, bearing the 1871 federal notation. The stake does not correspond to any legitimate boundary line associated with this property." "Say that again more slowly," Clara said. "I want every word." He said it again. She wrote every word. They moved to the second stake, the third. At each one, Amos spoke, and Clara wrote, building a record that had 2 names on it, one who knew the legal language of survey documents, and one who had built the land the document described. They were at the third stake when Amos stopped. "Someone's been here since this morning," he said. Clara looked up fast. He was crouching at the base of the stake, holding the lantern low. The dirt around its base had been disturbed, not removed, but pressed down in a specific way. "They tried to move it," Amos said. Clara crouched beside him. "Recently? Ground's still soft from where it was pressed," he said. "Tonight, after dark." He looked at the stake's position. "But they put it back." "Why?" Clara said. Amos straightened. "Because someone told them we already had measurements," he said. "And if the measurements we documented don't match where the stake ends up, it proves the stake was moved." He looked at her. "Crow got word of what we did this morning and realized moving the stakes now makes our documentation into evidence against him." Clara stared at the stake. "He's trapped," she said slowly. "Between 2 bad choices," Amos agreed. "Leave the stakes and they prove the fraud. Move them and they prove he knows the stakes are fraudulent." He stood up fully. "The only way he gets out of this is if our documentation never reaches a court." The significance of that sat between them in the dark. "We need to get back," Clara said. They came down off the north pasture in 17 minutes, which was faster than they'd gone up, and the house was lit, and Caleb was on the porch, and he was not alone. There was a horse at the gate that hadn't been there when they left, and beside Caleb on the porch was a compact, silver-haired man in a dark coat who turned when he heard them coming, and whose face Clara recognized from nothing she'd seen and everything she'd been told. Doc Purvis had not waited for morning. "Miss Bennett," Caleb said as she came up the porch steps. "This is Henry Purvis." "The letter reached me by messenger this afternoon," Purvis said. He had the direct, unhurried manner of a man who had been both a doctor and a justice of the peace long enough to have stopped being impressed by emergencies. He looked at Amos. "Amos, You look better than I expected. I've had some help, Amos said. Purvis looked at Clara. So I understand. He glanced at the journal in her hand. I hear you've been keeping records. I have, Clara said. Including records made in the last 40 minutes on the north boundary. She held his gaze. The stakes are still in position. Crow's men attempted to move them tonight and reconsidered. There's evidence of the attempt. Purvis went very still. Show me, he said. At first light, Clara said. The lantern's not enough for the kind of examination you'd want to make for a judicial record. She paused. But I can show you the documentation we have tonight, so you know exactly what you're going to see. Purvis looked at her for a long moment, the assessing look of a man deciding about a person. All right, he said. Coffee if you have it, and your documentation. Both, Clara said, and went inside. The kitchen table became a courtroom at 10 o'clock at night. Purvis went through every document with systematic thoroughness, the federal survey. The deed records the fraudulent county filing Clara's morning measurements, and the notes she'd just added from the boundary walk with Amos. He read without commentary, occasionally asking a specific question that revealed he already knew the context and was checking the details against it. Caleb sat across from him and answered questions when they came, and was otherwise quiet with the particular quality of quiet that meant he was paying close attention to everything. Judge Alderman, Purvis said, setting down the injunction. Crow's card partner, Caleb said. Among other things, Purvis said. William Alderman is also the signatory on the county survey filing. His name is on the approval stamp. He looked at Caleb. He's not just Crow's card partner. He's Crow's instrument. If this fraud goes to a territorial court, Alderman goes with it. The room absorbed that. That's why the injunction was filed so fast, Clara said. It wasn't just to stop us from documenting the boundary. It was to create a paper trail that made our documentation look like the obstruction. She thought it through out loud. If they can get our records characterized as interference before they reach a court, they might get them excluded. Purvis looked at her over the documents. That's exactly right, he said. You have a legal mind, Miss Bennett. I have a practical one, Clara said. Same result, different origin. Amos made the sound that was almost a laugh. He'd been making it more frequently. The injunction won't hold, Purvis said. It's signed by a compromised judge on the basis of a fraudulent claim. The moment this reaches a territorial court, it falls apart. He paused. But it only falls apart if the documentation reaches a territorial court intact and promptly. The letter to Henry Marsh, Caleb said. Marsh is good, Purvis said. But Crow has people watching the roads to Glenwood Springs. Dell carries your letter, and Crow will know it before it arrives. He looked at the documents. We need another channel. Silence. Francis Holt, Clara said. Everyone looked at her. The correspondent for the Colorado Territorial Gazette, she said. She was here this morning. She has a copy of the core documents, the federal survey, the county filing her own notes from our interview. She's filing her story in 3 days. Clara paused. But a newspaper story is public record. Once it's in print, every detail of the fraud is in the public domain. A territorial prosecutor would have grounds to open an investigation without needing our documents to arrive through official channels first. Purvis leaned back in his chair. Miss Holt is a credible journalist, he said slowly. Her reporting has broken 2 previous frauds in this territory. He looked at Clara. You told her everything. Everything I've told you, Clara said, with documentation. Purvis picked up his coffee, drank it, set it down. Then the story is the channel, he said. If Holt publishes before Crow can file his next move with the county court, he loses the legal timing advantage. He looked at Caleb. Do you have any way to reach her before she files? Caleb looked at Clara. Clara thought about Francis Holt on her horse moving fast and purposeful down the mountain road. She said 3 days, Clara said, but she also said she'd send a copy to Marsh on her way back through Glenwood Springs. She paused. She was going back through Glenwood Springs today. If she stopped at Marsh's office. The two of them together, Purvis said, sitting forward. Marsh files an emergency motion with the territorial court, Clara said, following the logic fast. Based on the documented fraud and the compromised county judge, the territorial court issues its own order superseding the county injunction. She looked at Purvis. How long would that take? With Marsh's name on the motion and a credible journalist's documentation supporting it, Purvis said, 2 days, maybe less. Crow has 2 days, Caleb said. Maybe less, Clara said. The plan was not a plan yet. It was a possibility that required multiple things to happen simultaneously in places none of them could directly control. Clara understood this. She understood that the pieces had been set in motion, and that the motion could not be stopped, now only managed, only shaped, where there was still room to shape it. Purvis stayed the night. Not in the house he set up in the barn with his horse, which he'd apparently done in similar circumstances enough times that he considered it unremarkable. Before he went, he signed his name to Clara's boundary documentation as a judicial witness, which gave everything she'd written the weight of a sworn statement. Caleb walked him to the barn and came back to find the kitchen almost dark. The fire banked and Clara at the table with the lamp turned low and her mother's journal open in front of her. He sat down. She didn't look up from what she was writing. "What are you adding?" he said. "Tonight's record," she said. "The visit from the process server. The injunction, Amos's boundary testimony. The evidence of attempted stake movement, Purvis's witness signatures." She paused. "If anything happens to the other documents, this journal is the account of everything that occurred." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You think something might happen to the other documents?" "I think Crow is a man who has 2 days, and a judge in his pocket, and a great deal to lose," Clara said. "I think careful is better than careless right now." He looked at her, the lamp making his face half shadow, half light, the way faces look when it's late, and the performance of the day has worn through to what's underneath. "You've been awake since before sunrise," he said. "So have you," Clara said. "I'm used to it." "I'm not fragile," she said. "I didn't say you were." He paused. "I said you've been awake since before sunrise, and you've been running at full pace every hour since, and I'm—" He stopped, started again. "I'm saying you can stop for a minute. The ranch will still be here if you close the journal for 10 minutes. Clara looked up. His expression was the same careful, open thing it had been in the root cellar, the unguarded version of Caleb Whitaker, that appeared when he stopped managing the distance he usually kept. She closed the journal. 10 minutes, she said. He didn't say anything immediately. The fire ticked. Outside, the summer night was deep and full, the stars of Colorado doing the extravagant thing they did at altitude that Clara had not grown up with and still wasn't used to. "Tell me about Missouri," he said. She looked at him, mildly surprised by the direction. "What about it?" "Whatever you want to tell," he said. "I want to know where you come from." Clara thought about that. She thought about Hannibal and the river and the household of 7 and her mother's kitchen, which had been the warmest room in a house that was otherwise always slightly cold, because there was never quite enough wood, and her father spent more time with his survey charts than his firebox. "My mother kept a kitchen the way your uncle's wife kept records," she said. "Like it mattered. Like the things she put into it were worth more than the sum of their ingredients." She paused. She used to say that a kitchen is where a family keeps its memory. That as long as you can smell what was cooked there, the people who cooked it aren't entirely gone. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like Margaret," he said. "I think they would have understood each other," Clara said. "What happened to her?" "Fever," Clara said. 3 winters ago. Same winter Amos lost his wife." She said it plainly, the way she always said it, not because it didn't hurt, but because the hurt had been lived with long enough to be carried without making a spectacle of it. "My father followed her inside of a year. He didn't know how to be in a house without her." Caleb looked at his hands. "I almost let that happen to Amos," he said. "You didn't know what to do," Clara said. "That's different from not caring." "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "Unambiguously." She met his eyes. "You kept this ranch. You kept showing up every morning and working the land and leaving wood by the kitchen door, even when no one was cooking. That's not a man who doesn't care. That's a man who didn't have the language for what he was doing." She paused. Some people show love in kitchens. Some people show it in fence lines and morning fires and a steady presence that never disappears, even when it hurts to stay. The lamp between them was very small and very warm. Caleb looked at her with the look that had been building, she realized, since the root cellar, since the aspen stand, since the kitchen table on the first night when she'd spread Amos's records under the lamplight and told him someone was trying to steal his water. "Clara," he said. "Caleb," she said. He reached across the table, not reaching for her hand, just reaching, setting his forearm on the table in the space between them, an opening rather than a conclusion. "I don't know what comes after this," he said. "After Crow, after the court, after all of it settles. I've been so focused on what's right in front of me that I haven't—" He stopped. "I'd like to know what you're thinking about after." Clara looked at his arm on the table, at his hands, which were large and work-scarred and had written survey measurements and a legal letter, and had helped her up onto a horse in Red Hollow 4 days ago with practical, impersonal efficiency that was now neither practical nor impersonal in any way she could honestly claim. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that I came west because I was looking for a place where what I know how to do matters, where the work I put in builds something that lasts." She looked up at him. "I'm thinking I may have found it, and I'm thinking that's—" She paused. "That's more than I was expecting. So I'm being careful with it." He held her gaze. "So am I," he said. The morning came fast and hard. Doc Purvis was at the north boundary before breakfast, and what he found there changed everything. He came back to the house at 7, with his coat dusty and his expression the controlled gravity of a man who has confirmed something he hoped he wouldn't. "The stakes are gone," he said. Clara set down the coffee pot. "All 3, Caleb said. "Everyone," Purvis said. "Pulled out, ground smoothed over. If you didn't know exactly where to look, you'd see nothing." He looked at Clara. "Which is exactly why your measurements from yesterday matter as much as they do right now." "If they pulled the stakes," Caleb started. "They've committed to the fraud," Purvis said. "Removing evidence of tampering is its own crime, and it tells us something." He sat down. "Crow thinks he's running out of time. He wouldn't pull those stakes if he believed he still had a clean play available." His eyes moved to the journal in Clara's hands. "He's trying to eliminate the physical evidence before the territorial court can get here." "Does he know about Purvis being here?" Clara said. "Someone will have told him by now," Purvis said. "A justice of the peace and judicial witness arriving at the Whitaker Ranch at 10 at night is not a quiet event." Clara looked at Caleb. "He'll move on the county court today," she said. "Try to get something filed before Marsh can counter it." "Can we get word to Marsh faster?" Caleb said. Purvis set a folded paper on the table. "I wrote to him last night," he said. "My rider left at dawn 2 hours ago. He's carrying my judicial statement that the county survey is compromised and that I witnessed primary documentation of fraudulent boundary marking." He paused. "He's also carrying a letter to the territorial prosecutor's office in Denver." The room went very still. "Denver," Caleb said. "Crow's fraud extends to federal survey tampering," Purvis said. "That's a federal matter. The territorial prosecutor has jurisdiction that supersedes the county court entirely." He looked at Clara. "Your instinct about the federal document was exactly right. That's the lever that opens the door the county court can't close." Clara put her hands flat on the table and breathed once. "How long to Denver?" she said. "Riders fast," Purvis said. 3 days. "Crow has 3 days," Caleb said. "He has less," Purvis said, "because Francis Holt's story runs in 2. The story ran in 1. They didn't know it until Dell came back from Glenwood Springs at mid-afternoon, a day earlier than expected, with his horse blown and his face carrying the expression of a man who has been riding hard because the news he's carrying required it. He came through the kitchen door without knocking, which he had never done before, and put the newspaper on the table in front of Clara. The Colorado Territorial Gazette. Front page. Above the fold. Land agent Silas Crow faces federal fraud allegations over forged survey in Red Hollow County. Documents secured by Whitaker family housekeeper expose decade-long scheme. Caleb read it standing up. Amos came in from the porch and read it over Caleb's shoulder. Clara had read it already in the time it took them to arrive, and was sitting very still with the particular stillness of someone absorbing something they had worked very hard to make happen and are now watching happen. She moved it up, Caleb said. Marsh must have convinced her, Clara said. Or the story was ready and she was waiting for the right moment. She looked at the paper. Either way, it's done. It's public. Crow can't undo public, Dell said. No. Purvis said from the doorway he had apparently also never left. He cannot. Amos sat down slowly. He picked up the paper and held it in both hands and read it again from the beginning, and Clara watched his face as he read and saw something complete itself there, some circuit that had been open for 3 years closing. She wrote about Margaret, he said. His voice was very quiet. Clara looked up. Francis Holt, Amos said. He held out the paper and pointed to a paragraph near the end. She wrote that the records that exposed the fraud were kept by the original property owner's wife over 30 years. She wrote Margaret's name. Clara reached across and read the paragraph. The documentation proving the fraud originated not from a lawyer or a court officer, but from a decade of careful record-keeping by the late Margaret Whitaker, whose meticulous property records preserved and ultimately deployed by the family's housekeeper, Miss Clara Bennett, demonstrated that Crow's scheme had been built on lies from its foundation. Clara lowered the paper. Amos's eyes were wet. He did not hide it and did not acknowledge it in the way of a man who has decided that some things are too real to manage. She's still protecting this place, he said. Even now. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Caleb put his hand on his uncle's shoulder, not briefly, not as a passing gesture, but firmly and fully, the way you hold on to something you came close to losing and have been given back. The county sheriff arrived at 2 in the afternoon, not Crow's hired men, not a process server. The actual sheriff, a broad, tired-looking man named Garrett, who had the expression of someone who had read the morning paper and spent the intervening hours reckoning with the implications. He had a deputy with him, and behind the deputy, his wrists bound, and his face carrying the particular blankness of a man who has run out of moves, was Silas Crow. Clara watched from the porch as Garrett tied his horse at the gate and came up the path. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "I owe you an apology and an explanation." Caleb stood at the top of the porch steps. "I'm listening," he said. "Crow attempted to file an emergency motion with Judge Alderman this morning to have your property records seized as fraudulent interference," Garrett said. "I was present when he tried." He paused. "I was also present when a wire arrived from the Territorial Prosecutor's Office in Denver, informing Judge Alderman that he is under investigation for judicial corruption in connection with fraudulent land filings." Garrett's jaw was set with the particular set of a man who is angry at himself for not having moved sooner. Alderman refused to sign Crow's motion. Crow attempted to leave the county. We stopped him on the Glenwood Springs Road. He held out an envelope. Caleb took it. Clara watched Caleb open it and read what was inside: a formal notification from the territorial prosecutor that the county survey filed by Silas Crow was under federal investigation, that all claims based on that survey were suspended pending investigation, and that the Whitaker family's property rights, including the north boundary spring access, were affirmed pending final resolution. Caleb read it twice. Then he handed it to Clara. She read it. Every word. She read the paragraph that suspended Crow's claim, and the one that affirmed the Whitaker boundary, and the one that cited specifically the 1871 Federal Survey document as the controlling legal description. She handed it back. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. Garrett looked at her with the expression she'd been receiving with increasing frequency from Red Hollow, the expression of people revising a conclusion they'd drawn too quickly. "You're the housekeeper," he said. "I am," Clara said. He looked at Caleb, then back at her. Something moved in his face. "The paper says you found the documents," he said. "The documents were already there," Clara said. "Margaret Whitaker put them there. I just knew what I was looking for." Garrett held her gaze for a moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said. The word had a different weight in it than the way it was usually said. Not the courteous deflection of a man managing an inconvenience, the genuine acknowledgement of a man addressing someone he has decided to respect. He turned and went back to his horse and his prisoner. Clara watched Silas Crow pass the porch gate with his hands bound and his expensive horse led behind the deputies. He didn't look at her. She had expected him to have expected some last attempt at dismissal or contempt, some parting gesture of the kind that men like him made when losing because they couldn't concede it completely. He didn't look at her at all. That told her more than any glare would have. The afternoon went quiet, in the way that only afternoons go quiet, when the thing you've been braced against has finally moved, and the bracing is no longer required. Amos went back to the porch. He sat in his chair with his coffee and his face in the late sun, and Clara saw from the kitchen window that he was not sitting with the vacancy of a man waiting to die, but with the attention of a man watching his land and finding it still there. Dell went back to the barn. She could hear him working the sound of tools of purposeful motion, of a man who had also been braced and was now releasing the tension into ordinary labor. Clara made dinner. She made it the way she made everything, with full attention and no shortcuts. She used the last of the preserved peaches for a second cobbler. She made the rosemary bread again. She made the stew with the beef from the cool cellar and the herbs from the garden, which she had been slowly restoring, cutting back the leggy growth and finding the live roots underneath, coaxing things back that had been left to themselves too long. She was at the stove when Caleb came in. He stood in the doorway, the same way he had on her first day, the same doorframe, the same stillness. But everything else had shifted, and they both knew it. "It's over," he said. "The immediate part," Clara said. "There'll be proceedings. Territorial court federal investigation. It takes time." "But Crow is done in this county," she said. "Yes." Caleb crossed the kitchen and sat down at the table. He looked at the room, the open window, the fire, the bread on the board, the herbs drying on the hook she'd put above the pantry door. "This room looks different than it did 4 days ago," he said. "It's had some attention," Clara said. "So has everything else," he said. He looked at her. "Clara." She turned from the stove. "I want to offer you something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I don't know how to say things any other way, and I think you'd want plainly regardless." "I would," she said. He put his hands flat on the table. It was the gesture of a man who was anchoring himself to something solid before he said a difficult true thing. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as the housekeeper, or not only as that. I want you to stay as a full partner in what happens to this ranch, in decisions in work, in what comes next." He held her gaze. "I want your name on this place, the way Margaret's name was on those records. Because this place survives because of what you knew and what you did, and that deserves more than wages." The kitchen was very still. Outside, Amos's chair scraped on the porch boards, and a bird called once from the aspen stand, and the fire settled in the stove with a small domestic sound. Clara looked at Caleb Whitaker across the table. "That's a significant offer," she said. "It's an honest one," he said. "There's nothing in it I don't mean." "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." She was quiet for a moment, not to make him wait, but to make sure what she said next was true. "I told you before that I came west looking for a place where what I know how to do matters, where I can build something that lasts." She held his gaze. 4 days ago, I didn't know whether this was that place. And now, he said. Clara turned back to the stove. She picked up the ladle and stirred the stew and felt the warmth of the kitchen around her. The herbs and the bread and the open window and the summer evening coming in and the man at the table with his hands flat on the wood, waiting for her answer. With the patience of someone who has learned that some things are worth waiting for. Now I'm thinking about where to plant the spring herb garden so it'll survive the first frost, she said. And I'm thinking the east side of the house gets enough shelter if we put a proper frame around it. She paused. I'm thinking long term. The silence that followed was the warmest silence she had known since Missouri. East side, Caleb said. That'll work. The herb garden frame went up on a Saturday. Caleb built it himself, which Clara had not asked him to do and had not expected. She came around the east side of the house that morning with her coffee and found him already at work posts in the ground. Cross braces going up the whole thing, oriented exactly as she'd described it, facing the morning sun, with its back to the prevailing wind off the mountain. He'd been up before her, which meant he'd been thinking about it before she woke, which meant he'd gone to sleep thinking about it the night before. She stood with her coffee and watched him work for a moment without announcing herself. He knew she was there. He didn't stop working. Frame'll hold through November, he said. After that, you'll want to mulch the roots deep if you want them to come back in spring. I know how to mulch roots, Clara said. I know you do, he said. I'm saying I'll help. She looked at the frame. At the careful, precise work of it, the joints fitted cleanly the wood, good chosen from the stack by someone who knew which pieces would hold, and which would split under freeze and thaw pressure. Thank you, she said. He looked up at her then from under the brim of his hat, with the morning light on his face. You're welcome, he said. That was all. It was enough. 3 weeks had passed since Sheriff Garrett had ridden Silas Crow down the mountain road. 3 weeks in which the ranch had settled into a new rhythm that was not entirely the old rhythm restored, but something different from it, the old rhythm made better, made fuller. The way a broken bone sometimes heals stronger at the fracture point than it was before. Amos was on the porch every morning before sunrise now. Not because Clara asked him, not because Caleb suggested it, but because he had rediscovered that the best part of the day on a mountain ranch was the hour before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, when the world was still cool and the light was coming, and the day had not yet required anything of anyone. He drank his coffee and watched the pastures come into color, and sometimes he talked to Margaret out loud, which Clara had heard once through the kitchen window, and had quietly moved away from, because some conversations deserve their privacy. Dell had hired a second ranch hand, a young man named Tomas, who had come up from the valley looking for work, and who ate 3 helpings of everything Clara cooked and had taken to splitting extra firewood, without being asked apparently, as a form of gratitude that he didn't know how else to express. The kitchen was warm every morning before anyone else was up. It had become that kind of kitchen, the kind that was a fact of the house, rather than a task someone performed in it. Clara had moved Margaret's herb bundles from the root cellar and hung them above the window, where the light caught them, not for decoration, but because dried herbs belong where someone can reach them without interrupting what they're doing at the stove. Red Hollow had revised its opinion of her, not all at once, not with apology. Small towns didn't do either of those things easily, but the women who had stood on Mrs. Aldrich's porch now nodded when they saw Clara on the supply wagon in town. The man at the general store had started setting aside the sage she used before she came in to ask for it. And Mrs. Aldrich herself had said nothing directly, had not apologized, had not acknowledged what she'd done, but had sent through an intermediary a small jar of her own apple preserves, with no note attached, which Clara understood to be as close to an apology as that particular woman was capable of, and accepted in that spirit. The territorial proceedings against Silas Crow were underway in Denver. Henry Marsh had written twice with updates. Judge Alderman had resigned from the county court rather than face the investigation, and the county survey based on his approval had been formally invalidated. The federal survey of 1871 had been re-registered as the controlling document for the Whitaker North boundary, which meant the spring was theirs, cleanly, legally, completely in a way that would not require defending again. Frances Holt's article had been picked up by two other territorial papers. She had written to Clara directly a brief professional note that said only, "The records made the story. The story made the outcome. Well done." Clara had put the note in her mother's journal, between the survey measurements and the page where she'd written down what Amos said at the north boundary, because it belonged with the records of things that mattered. It was on the fourth week that the letter arrived from Hannibal. Dell brought it up from the post office on Thursday, along with the regular supplies, and he handed it to Clara without comment, because the return address was a Missouri name, and he was a man who understood that some letters were private business. Clara recognized the handwriting on the envelope. It belonged to a woman named Ruth Hadley, who had been her mother's closest friend, and who had been the person Clara had said goodbye to when she left Hannibal, one of only two people who would notice she was gone. She put the letter in her apron pocket and finished helping Dell unload the supplies. She didn't open it until she was alone in the kitchen with the afternoon fire going and the house quiet around her. Ruth had written 3 pages in her close, careful hand. The first page was news, the ordinary news of Hannibal, the kind of news that meant everything when you'd lived in a place and nothing when you hadn't. The second page was more personal. Ruth's health, her daughter's new baby, the winter that had been hard on everyone. The third page was the reason for the letter. Clara, I am writing because I have heard something that I believe you should know, and I could not in good conscience keep it from you. James Whitfield. I know you will remember him, and I know what his name still costs. You has been asking after you. He has been told you went west, and he has been making what he calls inquiries, though what they are, in truth, is a man who made a very foolish choice, and has arrived too late at the understanding of what he threw away. I do not write to worry you. I write because I know you, and I know that you deserve to know what is behind you before it can become something that catches you unaware. Clara set the letter down on the table. She sat with it for a moment. James Whitfield was a name that belonged to the life she had left in Hannibal, a man she had trusted enough to make plans with, who had then found reasons one after another not to be the man she'd trusted. He had not been cruel about it. That was the thing about James Whitfield. He had never been dramatic about his failure. He had simply gradually become the man who was always about to do the right thing and never quite got there. She had not thought about him in weeks. She had been too busy doing real things with real people, in a real kitchen, on a real mountain ranch in Colorado, and the distance between that and James Whitfield's particular variety of absence was too great to bridge with much nostalgia. But she felt the letter. She felt it in the way of a woman who has rebuilt herself after a disappointment and now has to look at that disappointment clearly, not to fall back into it, but to know exactly where she stands in relation to it. She knew exactly where she stood. She folded the letter carefully. She got up and put it in the correspondence box on the kitchen shelf. Margaret's correspondence box, which had been repurposed as the general household records box, and which was becoming in its slow way a container for the documents of a new life being built in the same place the old one had been preserved. Then she went back to the stove and the afternoon's work, and did not think about James Whitfield again that day. She thought about him that evening, not with longing, with something more useful, the kind of thinking that a person does when they are examining the distance they have traveled and trying to understand what it means. Caleb found her on the porch after supper, which was where she had taken her coffee and her thinking, and he sat down in the chair beside her without asking, because in 3 weeks they had both stopped asking for the things that had become simply understood between them. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm often quiet," Clara said. "Different quiet," he said. "Thinking quiet, not resting quiet." She looked at him sideways. "You've learned to distinguish them." "You've taught me," he said, matter of fact. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I got a letter from Missouri today," she said. He waited. "From a friend of my mother's," she said. "She wrote to tell me that the man I was," she chose the word carefully, "planning a future with before I came west. He's looking for me." Caleb was very still in the way that was particular to him, the stillness of a man who is having a reaction and is not going to impose it on the conversation before he knows what's needed. "What do you want to do about it?" he said. "Nothing," Clara said. A pause. "Nothing," he repeated. "I left Hannibal because that life was finished," she said. "James Whitfield was finished. I'm not going back to a finished thing because the man involved has decided too late that he made a mistake." She looked at Caleb directly. "I know what I want. I knew it when I told you I was thinking long term. I knew it before that, if I'm being honest." She paused. "I just needed to look at the old thing clearly before I could say the new thing plainly." Caleb held her gaze. "What's the new thing?" he said. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. I'm past that. I want to stay because this is where I belong, because this kitchen and this land and this family," she held his eyes, "are what I was looking for when I got on the train in Hannibal, even though I didn't know yet what it looked like." The porch was very quiet. A night bird called somewhere in the dark aspens. Caleb reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with the performance of a man making a gesture. Simply the way he did everything directly and without waste, the way a man reaches for something he has decided is worth holding. Clara let him hold it. She turned her palm and held back. They sat like that on the porch in the summer dark, with the stars doing their extravagant Colorado thing overhead, and the ranch settled and breathing around them, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because everything that needed saying had been said, and the rest could wait for morning. The territorial court issued its final ruling on a Wednesday in August. Marsh wrote to inform them before the official document arrived a brief, precisely worded letter that said the federal survey had been upheld as the controlling document, that Crow's county filing had been vacated and expunged, that Crow himself had been indicted on 3 counts of fraud against the federal land office, and that Judge Alderman had been disbarred and was under separate investigation for judicial corruption. The spring on the north pasture belonged to the Whitakers, completely, irrevocably, in a way that had been established, fought for, documented, and defended, and that now existed in the permanent record of the territorial court as a settled matter. Caleb read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and was quiet for a long time. Amos, who had been given his own copy to read, sat across from him with his hands folded and his eyes on the table in the way of a man who is talking to someone who isn't in the room. "She knew," Amos said finally. "When she made me do the survey, when she made me write everything down, she knew this day would come." "She was usually right," Caleb said. "She was always right," Amos said. "I was just occasionally too stubborn to recognize it in real time." His voice was rough at the edges. "I recognize it now." Clara was at the stove. She had been giving them the space of the moment, keeping herself busy because this was their reckoning, and she was not the center of it. But Amos turned and looked at her, and his pale eyes had the clarity in them that had been growing steadily since the morning she'd opened the kitchen window. "Clara," he said. She turned. "Margaret kept this ranch alive through those records," he said. "You kept it alive by knowing what to do with them." He paused. "I don't have the words for what that is, but I want you to know that I see it, and that I'm grateful." Clara crossed to the table. She put her hand briefly on his brief warm, the gesture of a woman who understood exactly how much weight that statement carried and was not going to make him carry it longer than necessary. "She did the work," Clara said. "I just recognized it." Amos shook his head. "No," he said. "Don't do that. Don't make yourself small. It doesn't suit you, and it isn't true." Clara looked at him. "Accept the gratitude," he said. The same directness his nephew had, the same Colorado mountain voice shaped by distance, and the long habit of meaning what he said. "It's honestly given." Clara sat down. "Thank you, Amos," she said. He nodded once. Then he picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the pasture in the August morning light, and his face was the face of a man who is where he is supposed to be doing what he is supposed to do, in the company of people he trusts. The twist came from Marsh's second letter. It arrived 3 days after the first, and Clara was alone in the kitchen. When it came, Dell had handed it over at the door, and she'd opened it at the table, thinking it was a routine follow-up from the proceedings. It was not. There is one additional matter I should have included in my previous correspondence and did not, for which I apologize. In reviewing the Whitaker property documentation submitted as evidence, the territorial court clerk noted that the original deed filing from 1854, made by one Amos Whitaker, includes a co-signatory. The co-signatory is listed as Margaret Louise Whitaker. Under territorial law at the time of the original filing, a co-signed deed conveys joint and equal property rights. This is not standard in most deed filings of the period and appears to have been specifically requested by the filing party. Clara read it twice. Then she read the next paragraph. In consequence, the property rights that have now been affirmed by the territorial court are the rights of the Whitaker estate as established by the original filing, which named both Amos and Margaret Whitaker as equal co-owners. The court's ruling affirms these rights as they were originally established. I note this not because it changes anything in the practical outcome the property is secured and Crow's claim vacated, but because I believe the family should know that this protection was built into the original filing. Whoever requested the co-signatory arrangement had the foresight to make the legal protection complete from the beginning. Clara set the letter down. She sat very still. Amos had told her Margaret made him keep records. Margaret had made him hire a federal surveyor. And Margaret, a woman in 1854, in a territory that gave women almost no legal standing, had somehow persuaded her husband to make her a co-signatory on the original deed, which meant that even then, at the very beginning, she had understood that a day might come when the land would need defending, and she wanted her name on it in a way the law could not ignore. Clara thought about the correspondence box, about the recipe journal, about the dried rosemary sprig folded into a bundle of letters. She thought about a woman who had spent her whole life keeping records of things that mattered, and never letting anyone tell her those things didn't count, and who had been doing it since 1854, and who had in the end protected everything she built, even from beyond the point where she was there to protect it herself. Clara pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed once slowly. Then she got up and went to find Amos. He was on the porch. She sat in the chair beside him without preamble and held out the letter. He took it. He read it slowly. She watched his face as he read and saw the exact moment he reached the relevant paragraph, the stillness that came over him, the long exhale, the way his jaw worked once and then set. He lowered the letter to his lap. For a long time he said nothing. She asked me to put her name on the deed, he said finally. When we first filed, I thought it was... He stopped. I didn't understand why she wanted it. It seemed unnecessary. I almost said no. His voice was very quiet. She told me to just do it. She said she had a reason, and that I'd understand it eventually. He looked at the letter in his lap. I understand it now, he said. Clara looked at the man beside her, at the 64-year-old rancher who had been disappearing for 3 years, and had come back to himself one open kitchen window at a time, one bowl of rosemary stew at a time, one morning on the porch at a time. She loved this place as much as you do, Clara said. She just loved it in different ways, with different tools. She loved it better than I did, Amos said. She loved it smarter. She loved it as well as you did, Clara said firmly. And she made sure it would survive both of you. She held his gaze. That's not better or smarter. That's what you do when you love something. You make it able to last. Amos looked at her for a long moment. When are you and Caleb going to stop pretending you're being careful? He said. Clara blinked. I beg your pardon. I'm old, Amos said. I'm not blind. He picked up his coffee cup. He looks at you the way I used to look at Margaret, and you look at him the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching. He took a sip. Just thought someone should say it plainly. Clara sat with that for a moment. Someone just did, she said. She told Caleb about the letter that evening. He came in from the upper pasture at dusk, and she was waiting for him at the kitchen table with the letter and a cup of coffee that she'd timed to be hot when he arrived, because she had learned his schedule the way she'd learned everything in this house by paying attention. He read it standing up still in his work coat with the focused attention he brought to everything in writing that mattered. She watched his face move through the text the way she'd watched Amos's waiting for the paragraph. He reached it. He was still for a long time. Then he set the letter down and looked at her with an expression that was not complicated. Caleb Whitaker's expressions rarely were, because he was a man who had decided a long time ago that honesty was more useful than presentation. She put it there for exactly this moment, he said. Or for any moment when the ranch needed defending, Clara said. She didn't know what the threat would be. She just knew there would be one. Caleb looked at the letter again. She was always 3 steps ahead of everybody. She was prepared, Clara said. That's different from prescient. She didn't know the future. She knew that preparation outlasts crisis, and she prepared accordingly. She paused. Your uncle did the same thing. He kept the deed records. He hired the federal surveyor. He did it because she told him to, and he trusted her judgment, even when he didn't understand the reason. That's a particular kind of trust, Caleb said. The best kind, Clara said. He looked at her across the table. Clara, he said. Caleb, she said. I am not a man who says things before he means them, he said. I know, she said. So I want you to understand that when I say this, I have been meaning it for longer than I've been saying it. He held her gaze without flinching. I love you. Not because you saved this ranch, though you did. Not because you're capable and clear-headed, and you don't back down from hard things, though all of that is true. I love you because you opened that window on the first day, and because you knew Amos needed to smell the bread before he needed to eat it, and because you walked to the north boundary in the dark, and because you sat on this porch and held my hand, and made me feel like the thing I'd been doing alone all these years was something that could be done together. He paused. That's why. The kitchen was very still. Outside the window, the summer evening was doing its slow, gorgeous Colorado thing, the light going gold, and then amber, and then the deep, soft rose that came just before the stars. Clara stood up. She walked around the table. She took his face in both her hands the way her mother had taken her father's face when she meant what she was about to say, completely. No hedging. No distance. No managing of expectations. I love you, she said. I have been being careful with it because I learned the hard way that love without a solid foundation is just hope dressed up. But this foundation... She looked at him, at the hard, honest face, at the eyes that had seen her clearly from the first moment on the Red Hollow Street, is the most solid thing I've ever stood on. He put his hands over hers, both of them. Gently, the way he did everything that mattered with the full weight of his attention, and not 1 ounce of performance. Stay, he said. I already told you I'm staying, she said. I'm asking again, he said. Different reason. She looked at him for a long, full moment. Yes, she said. They were married on a Saturday in early October, when the aspens had gone gold and the mountain air had the clean, clarifying bite of the coming season. Doc Purvis performed the ceremony on the porch, because Amos said the porch was where the ranch began, and where the ranch should be witnessed making promises, and nobody argued with Amos on this point because he had been right about most things since he'd started sleeping with his door open. Dell was there. Tomas was there, wearing a clean shirt that didn't fit him correctly, which somehow made it better. Frances Holt had made the ride from Glenwood Springs and stood at the edge of the yard with her reporter's notebook in her coat pocket, that she did not take out because she had understood from the first visit that this family's private life was not a story. The women from the Red Hollow General Store were there. 3 of them. Clara had not invited them. She thought about that later and decided she was glad they'd come. Mrs. Aldrich was not there. Clara was also glad about that and felt no need to examine why. Amos walked Clara to the porch steps. He had asked to do it 3 days before in the kitchen in the morning with his coffee quietly and without ceremony. He said, I'd like to walk with you, if that's all right." She had said it was. He had nodded once and not mentioned it again until that morning when he appeared at her doorway in a clean suit she had not known he owned, and said, "Ready when you are," and offered his arm. At the porch steps before she went up, he stopped. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small dried rosemary sprig tied with kitchen string, the kind that had been in Margaret's correspondence box among her letters, the kind that Margaret had pressed and saved in the particular way of a woman who kept records of things that mattered. He tucked it into Clara's hand, without explanation. She looked up at him. "She would have loved you," he said. "I want you to know that. Not because you're capable, though you are. Because you know what a kitchen is for. Because you understand that the things we keep are the things we survive." His voice was rough and steady at once. "She would have called you family." Clara closed her hand around the rosemary sprig. "So would my mother," she said. He offered his arm again. She took it. They walked up the porch steps together. That winter, the kitchen stayed warm. Clara had put up preserves in the fall, the root cellar full again. Jars in their rows, the herb garden cut back and mulched deep on the east side of the house, where the frame Caleb had built protected the roots from the worst of the freeze. The rosemary had been cut back to its base and covered, which meant it would come back in April, stronger than it was before. Amos came to breakfast every morning. He was eating well. He had taken on the household accounts at Clara's suggestion, not because she couldn't manage them, but because he needed something to do with the meticulous record-keeping part of his mind that had been gathering dust, and because he did it better than she did, and both of them knew it. He and Clara had reached the particular understanding that exists between two people who are both capable and have divided their capabilities sensibly, which felt like respect and worked like partnership. The ranch hand Tomas had turned out to be gifted with horses in a way that quietly astonished Dell, who did not give astonishment easily. Dell had given him increasing responsibility with a gruffness that meant the same thing as praise, and that Tomas had learned to interpret correctly. Caleb worked the ranch the way he always had from before sunrise to after sunset, with the focused total attention of a man who loves what he does and does it at full capacity. The difference now was that he came home to a kitchen that was warm, and to a woman who had saved the ranch and married him, and was currently planning a second herb frame for the south wall, which she had determined would extend their growing season by 6 weeks. He came in one evening in November to find Clara at the table with her mother's journal open and her pen moving, and her expression the focused, private expression of a woman in the middle of something she wasn't ready to share yet. He sat down across from her without interrupting. He poured himself coffee. He waited. She looked up. "I'm writing down the recipes," she said. He looked at the journal. "You haven't written them down before." "Some of them," she said. "But I want to write them all, properly, with the measurements and the timing and the notes about what to do when something goes wrong." She paused. "My mother had them in this journal, but not all of them. Some of them were in her head, and I learned them by watching, and I never wrote them down because I thought I would always have her to ask." She looked at the page. "I don't have her to ask, and I don't want anyone to be in that position with mine." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Like Amos's deed records," he said. "Exactly like that," Clara said. "The things that keep a family are the things someone took the time to write down." He looked at her across the journal, across the lamp and the coffee and the record she was building in the same book that had carried her mother's handwriting across 1,000 miles and 4 days on a stagecoach, and into a kitchen that had been cold and was now the warmest room in a house full of people who had decided to stay. "Keep writing," he said. "I intend to," she said. She put her pen back to the page. Outside, the Colorado winter was doing its full and serious work. The snow coming down in the way it came at altitude, heavy and determined, covering the herb garden and the north pasture, and the spring that belonged to this family, and would keep belonging to this family for as long as there were records to prove it, and people with the knowledge and the will to defend them. Inside, the fire burned. The bread was on the board. The stew was on the stove. The records were being written in a hand that would not be lost. The woman the town of Red Hollow had thrown away in the summer dust had become the woman who held the memory of a mountain ranch in her hands, and she held it the way her mother had taught her, the way Margaret Whittaker had known to hold it, the way every woman who had ever kept a kitchen and called it love understood without needing it explained. You build it one day at a time. You write it down. You keep the fire going. And you make sure what you leave behind is strong enough to last without you. That was how you saved what mattered. That was how it stayed saved.